Section 32 of The Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1, edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Rome established as a republic. Institution of tribunes. B.C. 510 to 494. Henry George Liddell. The Republic of Rome was the outcome of a sudden revolution caused by the crimes of the House of Tarquin, an Etruscan family who had reached the highest power at Rome. The indignation raised by the rape of Lucretia by Sextus Tarquinius and the suicide of the outraged lady at Colatia moved her father, in conjunction with Lucius Junius Brutus and Publius Valerius, to start a rebellion. The people were assembled by curiae, or wards, and voted that Tarquinius Superbus should be stripped of the kingly power, and that he and all his family should be banished from Rome. This was accordingly done, and instead of kings, councils were appointed to wield the supreme power. These councils were elected annually at the Comitia Centuriata, and they had sovereign power granted them by a vote of the Comitia Curiata. The first consuls chosen were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. What is known as the secession to the Sacred Hill took place when the plebeians of Rome, in the early days of the Republic, indignant at the oppression and cruelty of the patricians, left the city en masse, and gathered with hostile manifestations at a hill, Mons Sacer, some distance from Rome. It was here Menenius Agrippa conciliated them by reciting the famous fable of the belly and the members. After this, the people were induced to come to terms with the patricians and to return to the city. The people had, however, gained a great advantage by their bold defiance of the consular and patrician class, who had practically been supreme in the state, had been oppressive moneylenders, and had controlled the decisions of the law courts. It was not in vain that the people now demanded that, as the two councils were practically elected to further the interests of the upper class, so they, the plebeians, should have the election of two tribunes to protect them from wrong and oppression. These new officers were duly appointed, and eventually their number was increased to 10. Their power was almost absolute, but it never seems to have been abused, and this fact is a proof of the native moderation of the ancient Romans. There have been many constitutional struggles in the history of modern times, but nothing like the plebeian tribunate has ever appeared, and it is a question if the institution could have existed for a month in any country of modern times with the salutary influence which it exercised in early Rome. Tarquin had made himself king by the aid of the patricians, and chiefly by means of the third or Lucerian tribe, to which his family belonged. The burgesses of the Gentes were indignant at the curtailment of their privileges by the popular reforms of Servius, and were glad to lend themselves to any overthrow of his power. But Tarquin soon kicked away the ladder by which he had risen. He abrogated, it is true, the hated Assembly of the Centuries, but neither did he pay any heed to the Curiate Assembly, nor did he allow any new members to be chosen into the Senate in place of those who were removed by death or other causes, so that even those who had helped him to the throne repented them of their deed. The name of Superbus, or the Proud, testifies to the general feeling against the despotic rule of the second Tarquin. It was by foreign alliances that he calculated on supporting his despotism at home. The Etruscans of Tarquinii and all its associate cities were his friends, and among the Latins also he sought to raise a power which might counterbalance the Senate and people of Rome. The wisdom of Tarquinius Priscus and Servius had united all the Latin name to Rome, so that Rome had become the sovereign city of Latium. The last Tarquin drew all those ties still closer. He gave his daughter in marriage to Octavius Mamilius, chief of Tusculum, and favored the Latins in all things. But at a general assembly of the Latins at the Ferentine Grove, beneath the Alban Mount, where they had been accustomed to meet of olden time to settle their national affairs, Turnus Herdonius of Aricia rose and spoke against him. Then Tarquinius accused him of high treason, and brought false witnesses against him, and so powerful with the Latins was the king that they condemned their countrymen to be drowned in the Ferentin water, and obeyed Tarquinius in all things. With them he made war upon the Volscians, and took the city of Suessa, wherein was a great booty. This booty he applied to the execution of great works in the city, in emulation of his father and King Servius. The elder Tarquin had built up the side of the Tarpeian rock, and levelled the summit, to be the foundation of a temple of Jupiter, but he had not completed the work. Tarquinius Superbus now removed all the temples and shrines of the old Sabine gods, which had been there since the time of Titus Tatius, but the goddess of youth and the god Terminus kept their place, whereby was signified that the Roman people should enjoy undecaying vigor, and that the boundaries of their empire should never be drawn in. And on the Tarpeian height he built a magnificent temple, to be dedicated jointly to the great gods of the Latins and Etruscans, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and this part of the Saturnian hill was ever after called the Capitol, or the chief place, while the upper part was called the Arx, or citadel. He brought architects from Etruria to plan the temple, but he forced the Roman people to work for him without hire. One day a strange woman appeared before the king and offered him 9 books to buy, and when he refused them she went away and burned 3 of the 9 books, and brought back the remaining 6, and offered to sell them at the same price that she had asked for the 9, and when he laughed at her and again refused, she went as before, and burned 3 more books, and came back and asked still the same price for the 3 that were left. Then the king was struck by her pertinacity, and he consulted his augurs what this might be, and they bade him by all means buy the 3, and said he had done wrong not to buy the 9, for these were the books of the Sibyl, and contained great secrets. So the books were kept underground in the Capitol in a stone chest, and 2 men, duumviri, were appointed to take charge of them, and consult them when the state was in danger. The only Latin town that defied Tarquin's power was Gabii, and Sextus, the king's youngest son, promised to win this place also for his father. So he fled from Rome and presented himself at Gabii, and there he made complaints of his father's tyranny and prayed for protection. The Gabians believed him and took him into their city, and they trusted him, so that in time he was made commander of their army. Now his father suffered him to conquer in many small battles, and the Gabians trusted him more and more. Then he sent privately to his father, and asked what he should do to make the Gabians submit. Then King Tarquin gave no answer to the messenger, but, as he walked up and down his garden, he kept cutting off the heads of the tallest poppies with his staff. At last the messenger was tired, and went back to Sextus and told him what had passed. But Sextus understood what his father meant, and he began to accuse falsely all the chief men, and some of them he put to death, and some he banished. So at last the city of Gabii was left defenseless, and Sextus delivered it up to his father. While Tarquin was building his temple on the Capitol, a strange portent offered itself, for a snake came forth and devoured the sacrifices on the altar. The king, not content with the interpretation of his Etruscan soothsayers, sent persons to consult the famous oracle of the Greeks at Delphi, and the persons he sent were his own sons, Titus and Aruns, and his sister's son, Lucius Junius, a young man who, to avoid his uncle's jealousy, feigned to be without common sense, wherefore he was called Brutus, or the dullard. The answer given by the oracle was that the chief power of Rome should belong to him of the 3 who should first kiss his mother, and the 2 sons of King Tarquin agreed to draw lots which of them should do this as soon as they returned home. But Brutus perceived that the oracle had another sense, so as soon as they landed in Italy he fell down on the ground as if he had stumbled, and kissed the earth, for she, he thought, was the true mother of all mortal things. When the sons of Tarquin returned with their cousin, Lucius Junius Brutus, they found the king at war with the Rutulians of Ardea. Being unable to take the place by storm, he was forced to blockade it, and while the Roman army was encamped before the town, the young men used to amuse themselves at night with wine and wassail. One night there was a feast at which Sextus, the king's third son, was present, as also Collatinus, the son of Egerius, the king's uncle, who had been made governor of Collatia. Soon they began to dispute about the worthiness of their wives, and when each maintained that his own wife was worthiest, "Come, gentlemen," said Collatinus, "let us take horse and see what our wives are doing. They expect us not, and so we shall know the truth." All agreed, and they galloped to Rome, and there they found the wives of all the others feasting and revelling. But when they came to Collatia, they found Lucretia, the wife of Collatinus, not making merry like the rest, but sitting in the midst of her handmaids, carding wool and spinning. So they all allowed that Lucretia was the worthiest. Now Lucretia was the daughter of a noble Roman, Spurius Lucretius, who was at this time prefect of the city. For it was the custom, when the kings went out to war, that they left a chief man at home to administer all things in the king's name, and he was called prefect of the city. But it chanced that Sextus, the king's son, when he saw the fair Lucretia, was smitten with lustful passion, and a few days after he came again to Collatia, and Lucretia entertained him hospitably as her husband's cousin and friend. But at midnight he arose, and came with stealthy steps to her bedside, and, holding a sword in his right hand, and laying his left hand upon her breast, he bade her yield to his wicked desires, for if not he would slay her, and lay one of her slaves beside her, and would declare that he had taken them in adultery. So for shame she consented to that which no fear would have wrung from her, and Sextus, having wrought this deed of shame, returned to the camp. Then Lucretia sent to Rome for her father, and to the camp at Ardea for her husband. They came in haste. Lucretius brought with him Publius Valerius, and Collatinus brought Lucius Junius Brutus, his cousin. And they came in and asked if all was well. Then she told them what was done. But, she said, my body only has suffered the shame, for my will consented not to the deed. Therefore, she cried, avenge me on the wretch Sextus. As for me, though my heart has not sinned, I can live no longer. No one shall say that Lucretia set an example of living in unchastity. So she drew forth a knife, and stabbed herself to the heart. When they saw that, her father and her husband cried aloud, but Brutus drew the knife from the wound, and holding it up, spoke thus: By this pure blood I swear before the gods, that I will pursue Lucius Tarquinius the Proud, and all his bloody house, with fire, sword, or in whatsoever way I may, and that neither they nor any other shall hereafter be king in Rome. Then he gave the knife to Collatinus and Lucretius and Valerius, and they all swore likewise, much marveling to hear such words from Lucius Junius the dullard. And they took up the body of Lucretia, and carried it into the Forum, and called on the men of Collatia to rise against the tyrant. So they set a guard at the gates of the town, to prevent any news of the matter being carried to King Tarquin, and they themselves, followed by the youth of Collatia, went to Rome. Here Brutus, who was chief captain of the knights, called the people together, and he told them what had been done, and he called on them by the deed of shame wrought against Lucretius and Collatinus, by all that they had suffered from the tyrants, by the abominable murder of good King Servius, to assist them in taking vengeance on the Tarquins. So it was hastily agreed to banish Tarquinius and his family. The youth declared themselves ready to follow Brutus against the king's army, and the seniors put themselves under the rule of Lucretius, the prefect of the city. In this tumult the wicked Tullia fled from her house, pursued by the curses of all men, who prayed that the avengers of her father's blood might be upon her. When the king heard what had passed, he set off in all haste for the city. Brutus also set off for the camp at Ardea, and he turned aside that he might not meet his uncle the king. So he came to the camp at Ardea, and the king came to Rome. And all the Romans at Ardea welcomed Brutus, and joined their arms to his, and thrust out all the king's sons from the camp. But the people of Rome shut the gates against the king, so that he could not enter. And King Tarquin, with his sons Titus and Aruns, went into exile and lived at Ceri in Etruria. But Sextus fled to Gabii, where he had before held rule, and the people of Gabii slew him in memory of his former cruelty. So Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was expelled from Rome, after he had been king 25 years. And in memory of this event was instituted a festival called the Regifugium, or Fugalia, which was celebrated every year on the 24th day of February. To gratify the plebeians, the patricians consented to restore, in some measure at least, the popular institutions of King Servius, and it was resolved to follow his supposed intention with regard to the supreme government, that is, to have 2 magistrates elected every year, who were to have the same power as the king during the time of their rule. These were in after days known by the name of councils, but in ancient times they were called praetors, or judges. They were elected at the great assembly of centuries, and they had sovereign power conferred upon them by the assembly of the curies. They wore a robe edged with violet color, sat in their chairs of state called curule chairs, and were attended by 12 lictors each. These lictors carried fasces, or bundles of rods, out of which arose an axe, in token of the power of life and death possessed by the councils as successors of the kings. But only one of them at a time had a right to this power, and in token thereof his colleagues' fasces had no axes in them. Each retained this mark of sovereign power, imperium, for a month at a time. The first consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. The new consuls filled up the Senate to the proper number of 300, and the new senators were called conscripti, while the old members retained their old name of patres. So after this the whole Senate was addressed by speakers as patres conscripti. But in later times it was forgotten that these names belonged to different sorts of persons, and the whole Senate was addressed by one name, patres conscripti. The name of king was hateful, but certain sacrifices had always been performed by the king in person, and therefore, to keep up form, a person was still chosen with the title of Rex Sacrorum or Rex Sacrificulus to perform these offerings, but even he was placed under the authority of the chief pontifex. After his expulsion, King Tarquin sent messengers to Rome to ask that his property should be given up to him, and the Senate decreed that his prayer should be granted. But the king's ambassadors, while they were in Rome, stirred up the minds of the young men and others who had been favored by Tarquin, so that a plot was made to bring him back. Among those who plotted were Titus and Tiberius, the sons of the consul Brutus, and they gave letters to the messengers of the king. But it chanced that a certain slave hid himself in the place where they met, and overheard them plotting, and he came and told the thing to the consuls, who seized the messengers of the king with the letters upon their persons, authenticated by the seals of the young men. The culprits were immediately arrested, but the ambassadors were let go, because their persons were regarded as sacred. And the goods of King Tarquin were given up for plunder to the people. Then the traitors were brought up before the consuls, and the sight was such as to move all beholders to pity, for among them were the sons of Lucius Junius Brutus himself, the first consul, the liberator of the Roman people. And now all men saw how Brutus loved his country, for he bade the lictors put all the traitors to death, and his own sons first, and men could mark in his face the struggle between his duty as a chief magistrate of Rome and his feelings as a father. And while they praised and admired him, they pitied him yet more. Then a decree of the Senate was made that no one of the blood of the Tarquins should remain in Rome, and since Collatinus, the consul, was by descent a Tarquin, even he was obliged to give up his office and return to Collatia. In his room Publius Valerius was chosen consul by the people. This was the first attempt to restore Tarquin the Proud. When Tarquin saw that the plot at home had failed, he prevailed on the people of Tarquinii and Veii to make war with him against the Romans. But the consuls came out against them, Valerius commanding the main army, and Brutus the cavalry. and it chanced that Aruns, the king's son, led the cavalry of the enemy. When he saw Brutus, he spurred his horse against him, and Brutus declined not the combat. So they rode straight at each other with levelled spears, and so fierce was the shock that they pierced each other through from breast to back, and both fell dead. Then also the armies fought, but the battle was neither won nor lost. But in the night a voice was heard by the Etruscans, saying that the Romans were the conquerors. So the enemy fled by night, and when the Romans arose in the morning, there was no man to oppose them. Then they took up the body of Brutus and departed home, and buried him in public with great pomp, and the matrons of Rome mourned him for a whole year, because he had avenged the injury of Lucretia. And thus the second attempt to restore King Tarquin was frustrated. After the death of Brutus, Publius Valerius ruled the people for a while by himself, and he began to build himself a home upon the ridge called Velia, which looks down upon the Forum. So the people thought that he was going to make himself king, but when he heard this, he called an assembly of the people, and appeared before them with his fasces lowered, and with no axes in them, whence the custom remained ever after that no consular lictors wore axes within the city, and no consul had power of life and death, except when he was in command of his legions abroad. And he pulled down the beginning of his house upon the Velia, and built it below that hill. Also, he passed laws that every Roman citizen might appeal to the people against the judgment of the chief magistrates. Wherefore he was greatly honored among the people, and was called Poplicola, or friend of the people. After this Valerius called together the great assembly of the centuries, and they chose Spurius Lucretius, father of Lucretius, to succeed Brutus. But he was an old man, and in not many days he died. So Marcus Horatius was chosen in his stead. The temple on the Capitol which King Tarquin began had never yet been consecrated. Then Valerius and Horatius drew lots which should be the consecrator, and the lot fell on Horatius. But the friends of Valerius murmured, and they wished to prevent Horatius from having the honor. So when he was now saying the prayer of consecration, with his hand upon the doorpost of the temple, there came a messenger, who told him that his son was just dead, and that one mourning for a son could not rightly consecrate the temple. But Horatius kept his hand upon the doorpost, and told them to see to the burial of his son, and finished the rites of consecration. Thus did he honor the gods even above his own son. In the next year Valerius was again made consul, with Titus Lucretius, and Tarquinius, despairing now of aid from his friends at Veii and Tarquinii, went to Lars Porsena of Clusium, a city on the river Clanus, which falls into the Tiber. Porsena was, at this time, acknowledged as chief of the 12 Etruscan cities, and he assembled a powerful army and came to Rome. He came so quickly that he reached the Tiber and was near the Sublician bridge before there was time to destroy it, and if he had crossed it the city would have been lost. Then a noble Roman, called Horatius Cottus, of the Lucerian tribe, with 2 friends, Spurius Lartius, a Romnian, and Titus Herminius, a Titian, posted themselves at the far end of the bridge, and defended the passage against all the Etruscan host, while the Romans were cutting it off behind them. When it was all but destroyed, his 2 friends retreated across the bridge, and Horatius was left alone to bear the whole attack of the enemy. Well he kept his ground, standing unmoved amid the darts which were showered upon his shield, till the last beams of the bridge fell crashing into the river. Then he prayed, saying, "Father Tiber, receive me and bear me up, I pray thee." So he plunged in, and reached the other side safely, and the Romans honored him greatly. They put up his statue in the Comitium, and gave him as much land as he could plow round in a day, and every man at Rome subscribed the cost of 1 day's food to reward him. Then Porsena, disappointed in his attempt to surprise the city, occupied the hill Janiculum, and besieged the city, so that the people were greatly distressed by hunger. But Gaius Mucius, a noble youth, resolved to deliver his country by the death of the king. So he armed himself with a dagger, and went to the place where the king was used to sit in judgment. It chanced that the soldiers were receiving their pay from the king's secretary, who sat at his right hand splendidly apparelled. And as this man seemed to be chief in authority, Mucius thought that this must be the king, so he stabbed him to the heart. Then the guards seized him and dragged him before the king, who was greatly enraged, and ordered them to burn him alive if he would not confess the whole affair. Then Mucius stood before the king and said, "See how little thy tortures can avail to make a brave man tell the secrets committed to him." And so saying, he thrust his right hand into the fire of the altar, and held it in the flame with unmoved countenance. Then the king marveled at his courage, and ordered him to be spared and sent away in safety. "For," said he, "thou art a brave man, and hast done more harm to thyself than to me." Then Mucius replied, "Thy generosity, O king, prevails more with me than thy threats. Know that 300 Roman youths have sworn thy death. My lot came first, but all the rest remain, prepared to do and suffer like myself." So he was let go and returned home, and was called Scaevola, or the left-handed, because his right hand had been burnt off. End of section 32. Section 33 of The Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1, edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Rome established as a republic. Institution of the Tribunes, B.C. 510 to 494, by Henry George Liddell. Part 2. King Porsenna was greatly moved by the danger he had escaped, and perceiving the obstinate determination of the Romans, he offered to make peace. The Romans gladly gave ear to his words, for they were hard pressed, and they consented to give back all the land which they had won from the Etruscans beyond the Tiber. And they gave hostages to the king, in pledge that they would obey him as they had promised, 10 youths and 10 maidens. But one of the maidens, named Cloelia, had a man's heart, and she persuaded all her fellows to escape from the king's camp and swim across the Tiber. At first King Porsenna was wroth, but then he was much amazed, even more than at the deeds of Horatius and Mucius. So when the Romans sent back Cloelia and her fellow maidens, for they would not break faith with the king, he bade her return home again, and told her she might take whom she pleased of the youth who were hostages, and she chose those who were yet boys, and restored them to their parents. So the Roman people gave certain lands to young Mucius, and they set up an equestrian statue to the bold Cloelia at the top of the Sacred Way, and King Porsenna returned home, and thus the third and most formidable attempt to bring back Tarquin failed. When Tarquin now found that he had no hopes of further assistance from Porsenna and his Etruscan friends, he went and dwelt at Tusculum, where Mamilius Octavius, his son-in-law, was still chief. Then the 30 Latin cities combined together, and made this Octavius their dictator, and bound themselves to restore their old friend and ally, King Tarquin, to the sovereignty of Rome. Publius Valerius, who was called Poplicola, was now dead, and the Romans looked about for some chief worthy to lead them against the army of the Latins. Poplicola had been made consul 4 times, and his compeers acknowledged him as their chief, and all men submitted to him as to a king. But now the 2 consuls were jealous of each other, nor had they power of life and death within the city, for Valerius, as we saw, had taken away the axes from the fasces. Now this was one of the reasons why Brutus and the rest made 2 consuls instead of 1 king, for they said that neither one would allow the other to become a tyrant, and since they only held office for 1 year at a time, they might be called on to give account of their government when their year was at an end. Yet, though this was a safeguard of liberty in times of peace, it was hurtful in time of war, for the consuls chosen by the people in their great assemblies were not always skillful generals, or, if they were so, they were obliged to lay down their command at the year's end. So the Senate determined, in cases of great danger, to call upon one of the consuls to appoint a single chief, who should be called dictator, or master of the people. He had sovereign power, imperium, both in the city and out of the city, and the fasces were always carried before him with the axes in them, as they had been before the king. He could only be appointed for 6 months, but at the end of the time he had to give no account, so that he was free to act according to his own judgment, having no colleague to interfere with him at the present, and no accusations to fear at a future time. The dictator was general in chief, and he appointed a chief officer to command the knights under him, who was called Master of the Horse. And now it appeared to be a fit time to appoint such a chief, to take the command of the army against the Latins. So the first dictator was Titus Lartius, and he made Spurius Cassius his master of the horse. This was in the year B.C. 499, 8 years after the expulsion of Tarquin. But the Latins did not declare war for 2 years after. Then the Senate again ordered the council to name a master of the people, or dictator, and he named Aulus Postumius, who appointed Titus Abudius, one of the consuls of that year, to be his master of the horse. So they led out the Roman army against the Latins, and they met at the Lake Regillus, in the land of the Tusculans. King Tarquin and all his family were in the host of the Latins, and that day it was to be determined whether Rome should be again subject to the tyrant, and whether or not she was to be chief of the Latin cities. King Tarquin himself, old as he was, rode in front of the Latins in full armor, and when he descried the Roman dictator marshalling his men, he rode at him, but Postumius wounded him in the side, and he was rescued by the Latins. Then also Abudius, the master of the horse, and Octavius Mamilius, the dictator of the Latins, charged one another, and Abudius was pierced through the arm, and Mamilius wounded in the breast. But the Latin chief, nothing daunted, returned to battle, followed by Titus the king's son, with his band of exiles. These charged the Romans furiously, so that they gave way. But when Marcus Valerius, brother of the great Poplicola, saw this, he spurred his horse against Titus, and rode at him with spear in rest. And when Titus turned away and fled, Valerius rode furiously after him into the midst of the Latin host, and a certain Latin smote him in the side as he was riding past, so that he fell dead, and his horse galloped on without a rider. So the band of exiles pressed still more fiercely upon the Romans, and they began to flee. Then Postumius the dictator lifted up his voice, and vowed a temple to Castor and Pollux, the great twin heroes of the Greeks, if they would aid him. And behold, there appeared on his right 2 horsemen, taller and fairer than the sons of men, and their horses were as white as snow. And they led the dictator and his guard against the exiles and the Latins, and the Romans prevailed against them, and Titus Herminius the Titian, the friend of Horatius Cocles, ran Mamilius, the dictator of the Latins, through the body, so that he died. But when he was stripping the arms from his foe, another ran him through, and he was carried back to the camp, and he also died. Then also Titus, the king's son, was slain, and the Latins fled, and the Romans pursued them with great slaughter, and took their camp and all that was in it. Now Postumius had promised great rewards to those who first broke into the camp of the Latins, and the first who broke in were the 2 horsemen on white horses. But after the battle they were nowhere to be seen or found, nor was there any sign of them left, save on the hard rock there was the mark of a horse's hoof, which men said was made by the horse of one of those horsemen. But at this very time 2 youths on white horses rode into the Forum at Rome. They were covered with dust and sweat and blood, like men who had fought long and hard, and their horses also were bathed in sweat and foam. And they alighted near the temple of Vesta, and washed themselves in a spring that gushes out hard by, and told all the people in the Forum how the battle by the Lake Regillus had been fought and won. Then they mounted their horses and rode away, and were seen no more. But Postumius, when he heard it, knew that these were Castor and Pollux, the great twin brethren of the Greeks, and that it was they who fought so well for Rome at the Lake Regillus. So he built them a temple according to his vow, over the place where they had alighted in the Forum, and their effigies were displayed on Roman coins to the latest ages of the city. This was the 4th and last attempt to restore King Tarquin. After the great defeat of Lake Regillus, the Latin cities made peace with Rome, and agreed to refuse harborage to the old king. He had lost all his sons, and accompanied by a few faithful friends who shared his exile, he sought a last asylum at the Greek city of Cumae in the Bay of Naples, at the court of the tyrant Aristodemus. Here he died in the course of a year, 14 years after his expulsion. We shall now record not only the slow steps by which the Romans recovered dominion over their neighbors, but also the long continued struggle by which the plebeians raised themselves to a level with the patricians, who had again become the dominant caste at Rome. Mixed up with legendary tales, as the history still is, enough is nevertheless preserved to excite the admiration of all who love to look upon a brave people pursuing a worthy object with patient but earnest resolution, never flinching, yet seldom injuring their good cause by reckless violence. To an Englishman this history ought to be especially dear, for more than any other in the annals of the world does it resemble the long enduring constancy and sturdy determination, the temperate will and noble self control, with which the commons of his own country secured their rights. It was by a struggle of this nature, pursued through a century and a half, that the character of the Roman people was molded into that form of strength and energy which threw back Hannibal to the coasts of Africa, and in half a century more made them masters of the Mediterranean shore. There can be no doubt that the wars that followed the expulsion of the Tarquins, with the loss of territory that accompanied them, must have reduced all orders of men at Rome to great distress. But those who most suffered were the plebeians. The plebeians at that time consisted entirely of landholders, great and small, and husbandmen, for in those times the practice of trades and mechanical arts was considered unworthy of a freeborn man. Some of the plebeian families were as wealthy as any among the patricians, but the mass of them were petty yeomen, who lived on the produce of their small farm, and were solely dependent for a living on their own limbs, their own thrift and industry. Most of them lived in the villages and small towns, which in those times were thickly sprinkled over the slopes of the Campagna. The patricians, on the other hand, resided chiefly within the city. If slaves were few as yet, they had the labor of their clients available to till their farms, and through their clients also they were enabled to derive a profit from the practice of trading in crafts, which personally neither they nor the plebeians would stoop to pursue. Besides these sources of profit, they had at this time the exclusive use of the public land, a subject on which we shall have to speak more at length hereafter. At present it will be sufficient to say that the public land now spoken of had been the crown land or regal domain, which on the expulsion of the kings had been forfeited to the state. The patricians being in possession of all actual power, engrossed possession of it, and seem to have paid a very small quit rent to the treasury for this great advantage. Besides this, the necessity of service in the army or militia, as it might more justly be called, acted very differently on the rich landholder and the small yeoman. The latter, being called out with sword and spear for the summer's campaign, as his turn came round, was obliged to leave his farm uncared for, and his crop could only be reaped by the kind aid of neighbors, whereas the rich proprietor, by his clients or his hired laborers, could render the required military service without robbing the land of his own labor. Moreover, the territory of Rome was so narrow, and the enemy's borders so close at hand, that any night the stout yeoman might find himself reduced to beggary, by seeing his crops destroyed, his cattle driven away, and his homestead burnt in a sudden foray. The patricians and rich plebeians were, it is true, exposed to the same contingencies. But wealth will always provide some defense, and it is reasonable to think that the larger proprietors provided places of refuge into which they could drive their cattle and secure much of their property, such as the peel towers common in our own border counties. Thus the patricians and their clients might escape the storm which destroyed the isolated yeoman. To this must be added that the public land seems to have been mostly in pasturage, and therefore the property of the patricians must have chiefly consisted in cattle, which was more easily saved from depredation than the crops of the plebeian. Lastly, the profit derived from the trades and business of their clients, being secured by the walls of the city, gave to the patricians the command of all the capital that could exist in a state of society so simple and crude, and afforded at once a means of repairing their own losses and also of obtaining a dominion over the poor yeomen. For some time after the expulsion of the Tarquins, it was necessary for the patricians to treat the plebeians with liberality. The institutions of the Commons King, King Servius, suspended by Tarquin, were, partially at least, restored. It is said even that one of the first consuls was a plebeian, and that he chose several of the leading plebeians into the Senate. But after the death of Porsenna, and when the fear of the Tarquins ceased, all these flattering signs disappeared. The consuls seem still to have been elected by the centuriate assembly, but the curiate assembly retained in their own hands the right of conferring the imperium, which amounted to a positive veto on the election by the larger body. All the names of the early consuls, except in the first year of the Republic, are patrician. But if by chance a consul displayed popular tendencies, it was in the power of the Senate and patricians to suspend his power by the appointment of a dictator. Thus, practically, the patrician burgesses again became the populace, or body politic, of Rome. It must not here be forgotten that this dominant body was an exclusive caste, that is, it consisted of a limited number of noble families, who allowed none of their members to marry with persons born out of the pale of their own order. The child of a patrician and a plebeian, or of a patrician and a client, was not considered as born in lawful wedlock, and however proud the blood which it derived from one parent, the child sank to the condition of the parent of lower rank. This was expressed in Roman language by saying that there was no right of connubium between patricians and any inferior classes of men. Nothing can be more impolitic than such restrictions, nothing more hurtful even to those who count it their privilege. In all exclusive or oligarchical pales, families become extinct, and the breed decays both in bodily strength and mental vigor. Happily for Rome, the patricians were unable long to maintain themselves as a separate caste. Yet the plebeians might long have submitted to this state of social and political inferiority, had not their personal distress and the severe laws of Rome driven them to seek relief by claiming to be recognized as members of the body politic. The severe laws of which we speak were those of debtor and creditor. If a Roman borrowed money, he was expected to enter into a contract with his creditor to pay the debt by a certain day, and if on that day he was unable to discharge his obligation, he was summoned before the patrician judge, who was authorized by the law to assign the defaulter as a bondsman to his creditor; that is, the debtor was obliged to pay by his own labor the debt which he was unable to pay in money. Or if a man incurred a debt without such formal contract, the rule was still more imperious, for in that case the law itself fixed the day of payment, and if after a lapse of 30 days from that date the debt was not discharged, the creditor was empowered to arrest the person of his debtor, to load him with chains, and feed him on bread and water for another 30 days, and then, if the money still remained unpaid, he might put him to death, or sell him as a slave to the highest bidder, or, if there were several creditors, they might hew his body in pieces and divide it. And in this last case the law provided with scrupulous providence against the evasion by which the merchant of Venice escaped the cruelty of the Jew, for the Roman law said that whether a man cut more or less than his due, he should incur no penalty. These atrocious provisions, however, defeated their own object, for there was no more unprofitable way in which the body of a debtor could be disposed of. Such being the law of debtor and creditor, it remains to say that the creditors were chiefly of the patrician caste, and the debtors almost exclusively of the poorer sort among the plebeians. The patricians were the creditors because from their occupancy of the public land, and from their engrossing the profits to be derived from trade and crafts, they alone had spare capital to lend. The plebeian yeomen were the debtors because their independent position made them, at that time, helpless. Vassals, clients, serfs, or by whatever name dependents are called, do not suffer from the ravages of a predatory war like free landholders, because the loss falls on their lords or patrons. But when the independent yeoman's crops are destroyed, his cattle lifted, and his homestead in ashes, he must himself repair the loss. This was, as we have said, the condition of many Roman plebeians. To rebuild their houses and restock their farms, they borrowed. The patricians were their creditors, and the law, instead of protecting the smallholders, like the law of the Hebrews, delivered them over into serfdom or slavery. Thus the free plebeian population might have been reduced to a state of mere dependency, and the history of Rome might have presented a repetition of monotonous severity, like that of Sparta or of Venice. But it was ordained otherwise. The distress and oppression of the plebeians led them to demand and to obtain political protectors, by whose means they were slowly but surely raised to the equality of rights and privileges with their rulers and oppressors. These protectors were the famous tribunes of the plebs. We will now repeat the no less famous legends by which their first creation was accounted for. It was, by the common reckoning, 15 years after the expulsion of the Tarquins, B.C. 494, that the plebeians were roused to take the first step in the assertion of their rights. After the battle of Lake Regillus, the plebeians had reason to expect some relaxation of the law of debt, in consideration of the great services they had rendered in the war. But none was granted. The patrician creditors began to avail themselves of the severity of the law against their plebeian debtors. The discontent that followed was great, and the consuls prepared to meet the storm. These were Appius Claudius, the proud Sabine nobleman who had lately become a Roman, and who now led the high patrician party with all the unbending energy of a chieftain whose will had never been disputed by his obedient clansmen, and Publius Servilius, who represented the milder and more liberal party of the Fathers. It chanced that an aged man rushed into the Forum on a market day, loaded with chains, clothed with a few scanty rags, his hair and beard long and squalid, his whole appearance ghastly, as of one oppressed by long want of food and air. He was recognized as a brave soldier, the old comrade of many who thronged the Forum. He told his story, how that in the late wars the enemy had burned his house and plundered his little farm, that to replace his losses he had borrowed money of a patrician, that his cruel creditor, in default of payment, had thrown him into prison and tormented him with chains and scourges. At this sad tale the passions of the people rose high. Appius was obliged to conceal himself, while Servilius undertook to plead the cause of the plebeians with the Senate. Meantime, news came to the city that the Roman territory was invaded by the Volscian foe. The consuls proclaimed a levy, but the stout yeomen, one and all, refused to give in their names and take the military oath. Servilius now came forward, and proclaimed by edict that no citizen should be imprisoned for debt so long as the war lasted, and that at the close of the war he would propose an alteration of the law. The plebeians trusted him, and the enemy was driven back. But when the popular council returned with his victorious soldiers, he was denied a triumph, and the Senate, led by Appius, refused to make any concession in favor of the debtors. The anger of the plebeians rose higher and higher, when again news came that the enemy was ravaging the lands of Rome. The Senate, well knowing that the power of the consuls would avail nothing, since Appius was regarded as a tyrant, and Servilius would not choose again to become an instrument for deceiving the people, appointed a dictator to lead the citizens into the field. But to make the act as popular as might be, they named Marcus Valerius, a descendant of the great Poplicola. The same scene was repeated over again. Valerius protected the plebeians against their creditors while they were at war, and promised them relief when war was over. But when the danger was gone by, Appius again prevailed, the Senate refused to listen to Valerius, and the dictator laid down his office, calling gods and men to witness that he was not responsible for his breach of faith. The plebeians who Valerius had led forth were still under arms, still bound by their military oath, and Appius, with the violent patricians, refused to disband them. The army, therefore, having lost Valerius, their proper general, chose two of themselves, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Sicinius Bellutus by name, and under their command they marched northward and occupied the hill which commands the junction of the Tiber and the Anio. Here, at a distance of about 2 miles from Rome, they determined to settle and form a new city, leaving Rome to the patricians and their clients. But the latter were not willing to lose the best of their soldiery, the cultivators of the greater part of the Roman territory, and they sent repeated embassies to persuade the seceders to return. They, however, turned a deaf ear to all promises, for they had too often been deceived. Appius now urged the Senate and patricians to leave the plebeians to themselves. The nobles and their clients, he said, could well maintain themselves in the city without such base aid. But wiser sentiments prevailed. Titus Lartius and Marcus Valerius, both of whom had been dictators, with Menenius Agrippa, an old patrician of popular character, were empowered to treat with the people. Still their leaders were unwilling to listen, till old Menenius addressed them in the famous fable of the belly and the members. "In times of old," said he, "when every member of the body could think for itself, and each had a separate will of its own, they all, with one consent, resolved to revolt against the belly. They knew no reason, they said, why they should toil from morning till night in its service, while the belly lay at its ease in the midst of all, and indolently grew fat upon their labors. Accordingly they agreed to support it no more. The feet vowed they would carry it no longer, the hands that they would do no more work, the teeth that they would not chew a morsel of meat, even if it were placed between them. Thus resolved, the members for a time showed their spirit and kept their resolution, but soon they found that instead of mortifying the belly, they only undid themselves. They languished for a while, and perceived too late that it was owing to the belly that they had strength to work and courage to mutiny." The moral of this fable was plain. The people readily applied it to the patricians and themselves, and their leaders proposed terms of agreement to the patrician messengers. They required that the debtors who could not pay should have their debts cancelled, and that those who had been given up into slavery should be restored to freedom. This for the past. And as a security for the future, they demanded that two of themselves should be appointed for the sole purpose of protecting the plebeians against the patrician magistrates, if they acted cruelly or unjustly toward the debtors. The two officers thus to be appointed were called tribunes of the plebs. Their persons were to be sacred and inviolable during their year of office, whence their office is called sacrosancta potestas. They were never to leave the city during that time, and their houses were to be open day and night, that all who needed their aid might demand it without delay. This concession, apparently great, was much modified by the fact that the patricians insisted on the election of the tribunes being made at the comitia of the centuries, in which they themselves and their wealthy clients could usually command a majority. In later times the number of the tribunes was increased to 5, and afterward to 10. They were elected at the comitia of the tribes. They had the privilege of attending all sittings of the Senate, though they were not considered members of that famous body. Above all, they acquired the great and perilous power of the veto, by which any one of their number might stop any law or annul any decree of the Senate without cause or reason assigned. This right of veto was called the right of intercession. On the spot where this treaty was made, an altar was built to Jupiter, the causer and banisher of fear, for the plebeians had gone thither in fear and returned from it in safety. The place was called Mons Sacer, or the Sacred Hill, for ever after, and the laws by which the sanctity of the tribunician office was secured were called the Leges Sacratae. The tribunes were not properly magistrates or officers, for they had no express functions or official duties to discharge. They were simply representatives and protectors of the plebs. At the same time, however, with the institution of these protective officers, the plebeians were allowed the right of having 2 aediles chosen from their own body, whose business it was to preserve order and decency in the streets, to provide for the repair of all buildings and roads there, with other functions partly belonging to police officers and partly to commissioners of public works. End of section 33.
Section 34 of The Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Gillespie, Ashland, Kentucky. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Battle of Marathon, B.C. 490, Part 1. By Sir Edward Shepherd Creasy. Marathon. A name to conjure up such visions of glory as few battlefields have ever shown. Heroism and determination on the part of the Athenians, supported by the small but ever noble band of Plataeans who came to their aid. Who can read the repulse of the Persians on this ever memorable plain without experiencing a thrill of admiration and delight at the achievement? The whole world, since that battle, has looked upon it as a victory of the underdog. Many of the great engagements of modern times have been likened unto it. For long, it has been the synonym of brave despair, the conquering of an enemy many times superior in numbers to its opponents. This attempt of the Persians on the Greeks was not the first against them. That took place B.C. 493 under Mardonius. This commander had reduced Ionia, dethroned the despots, and established democracy throughout the land. After this, he turned his attention to Eretria and Athens, taking his army across the straits in vessels. But the ships of war and transports were wrecked by a mighty headwind as they rounded Mount Athos. Many were driven ashore, about 300 of them were totally lost, and some 20,000 men perished in the catastrophe. All the trouble between the Persians and Greeks arose over the capture of Sardis by the Ionians, B.C. 500. The city was burned, and then the Ionians retreated. It was to avenge this that Persia determined on a punitive expedition against the Greeks. The Ionians and Malaysian men were mostly slain by the Persians, the women and children led into captivity, and the temples in the cities burned and razed to the ground. In the Battle of Marathon, which succeeded these events, we have a vivid picture presented to us in Creasy's glowing words. 2,340 years ago, a council of Athenian officers was summoned on the slope of one of the mountains that look over the plain of Marathon on the eastern coast of Attica. The immediate subject of their meeting was to consider whether they should give battle to an enemy that lay encamped on the shore beneath them. But on the result of their deliberations depended not merely the fate of two armies, but the whole future progress of human civilization. Now, there were 11 members of that council of war. 10 were the generals who were then annually elected at Athens, one for each of the local tribes into which the Athenians were divided. Each general led the men of his own tribe, and each was invested with equal military authority. But one of the archons was also associated with them in the general command of the army. This magistrate was termed the Polemarch, or war ruler. He had the privilege of leading the right wing of the army in battle, and his vote in a council of war was equal to that of any of the generals. A noble Athenian named Callimachus was the war ruler of this year, and as such stood listening to the earnest discussion of the 10 generals. They had indeed deep matter for anxiety, though little aware how momentous to mankind were the votes they were about to give, or how the generations to come would read with interest the record of their discussions. They saw before them the invading forces of a mighty empire, which had in the last 50 years shattered and enslaved nearly all the kingdoms and principal cities of the then known world. They knew that all the resources of their own country were comprised in the little army entrusted to their guidance. They saw before them a chosen host of the great king sent to wreak his special wrath on that country and on the other insolent little Greek community which had dared to aid his rebels and burn the capital of one of his provinces. That victorious host had already fulfilled half its mission of vengeance. Eretria, the confederate of Athens in the bold march against Sardis 9 years before, had fallen in the last few days, and the Athenian generals could discern from the heights the island of Agilia, in which the Persians had deposited their Eretrian prisoners, whom they had reserved to be led away captives into Upper Asia, there to hear their doom from the lips of King Darius himself. Moreover, the men of Athens knew that in the camp before them was their own banished tyrant, who was seeking to be reinstated by foreign scimitars in a despotic sway over any remnant of his countrymen that might survive the sack of their town and might be left behind as too worthless for leading away into Median bondage. The numerical disparity between the force which the Athenian commanders had under them and that which they were called on to encounter was hopelessly apparent to some of the council. The historians who wrote nearest to the time of the battle do not pretend to give any detailed statements of the numbers engaged, but there are sufficient data for our making a general estimate. Every free Greek was trained to military duty, and from the incessant border wars between the different states, few Greeks reached the age of manhood without having seen some service. But the muster roll of free Athenian citizens of an age fit for military duty never exceeded 30,000, and at this epoch probably did not amount to 2/3 of that number. Moreover, the poorer portion of these were unprovided with the equipments and untrained to the operations of the regular infantry. Some detachments of the best armed troops would be required to garrison the city itself and man the various fortified posts in the territory, so that it is impossible to reckon the fully equipped force that marched from Athens to Marathon when the news of the Persian landing arrived at higher than 10,000 men. With one exception, the other Greeks held back from aiding them. Sparta had promised assistance, but the Persians had landed on the 6th day of the moon, and a religious scruple delayed the march of Spartan troops till the moon should have reached its full. From one quarter only, and that from a most unexpected one, did Athens receive aid at the moment of her great peril. Some years before this time, the little state of Plataea in Boeotia, being hard pressed by her powerful neighbor Thebes, had asked the protection of Athens, and had owed to an Athenian army the rescue of her independence. Now when it was noised over Greece that the Mede had come from the uttermost parts of the earth to destroy Athens, the brave Plataeans, unsolicited, marched with their whole force to assist the defense and to share the fortunes of their benefactors. The general levy of the Plataeans amounted only to 1,000 men, and this little column, marching from their city along the southern ridge of Mount Cithaeron and thence across the Attic territory, joined the Athenian forces above Marathon almost immediately before the battle. The reinforcement was numerically small, but the gallant spirit of the men who composed it must have made it of tenfold value to the Athenians, and its presence must have gone far to dispel the cheerless feeling of being deserted and friendless, which the delay of the Spartan succors was calculated to create among the Athenian ranks. This generous daring of their weak but true-hearted ally was never forgotten at Athens. The Plataeans were made the civil fellow-countrymen of the Athenians, except the right of exercising certain political functions. And from that time forth, in the solemn sacrifices at Athens, the public prayers were offered up for a joint blessing from heaven upon the Athenians and the Plataeans also. After the junction of the column from Plataea, the Athenian commanders must have had under them about 11,000 fully armed and disciplined infantry, and probably a large number of irregular, light-armed troops, as, besides the poorer citizens who went to the field armed with javelins, cutlasses, and targets, each regular, heavy-armed soldier was attended in the camp by one or more slaves who were armed like the inferior freemen. Cavalry or archers the Athenians, on this occasion, had none, and the use in the field of military engines was not at that period introduced into ancient warfare. Contrasted with their own scanty forces, the Greek commanders saw stretched before them along the shores of the winding bay the tents and shipping of the varied nations who marched to do the bidding of the king of the eastern world. The difficulty of finding transports and of securing provisions would form the only limit to the numbers of a Persian army. Nor is there any reason to suppose the estimate of Justin exaggerated, who rates at 100,000 the force which on this occasion had sailed under the satraps Datis and Artaphernes from the Cilician shores against the devoted coasts of Euboea and Attica. And after largely deducting from this total, so as to allow for mere mariners and camp followers, there must still have remained fearful odds against the national levies of the Athenians. Nor could Greek generals then feel that confidence in the superior quality of their troops, which ever since the Battle of Marathon has animated Europeans in conflicts with Asiatics, as for instance in the after-struggles between Greece and Persia, or when the Roman legions encountered the myriads of Mithridates and Tigranes, or as is the case in the Indian campaigns of our own regiments. On the contrary, up to the day of Marathon, the Medes and Persians were reputed invincible. They had more than once met Greek troops in Asia Minor, in Cyprus, in Egypt, and had invariably beaten them. Nothing can be stronger than the expressions used by the early Greek writers respecting the terror which the name of the Medes inspired, and the prostration of men's spirits before the apparently resistless career of the Persian arms. It is, therefore, little to be wondered at that the 5 of the 10 Athenian generals shrank from the prospect of fighting a pitched battle against an enemy so superior in numbers and so formidable in military renown. Their own position on the heights was strong and offered great advantages to a small defending force against assailing masses. They deemed it mere foolhardiness to descend into the plain to be trampled down by the Asiatic horse, overwhelmed with the archery, or cut to pieces by the invincible veterans of Cambyses and Cyrus. Moreover, Sparta, the great war state of Greece, had been applied to and had promised succor to Athens, though the religious observance which the Dorians paid to certain times and seasons had for the present delayed their march. Was it not wise at any rate to wait till the Spartans came up, and to have the help of the best troops in Greece before they exposed themselves to the shock of the dreaded Medes? Specious as these reasons might appear, the other 5 generals were for speedier and bolder operations. And fortunately for Athens and for the world, one of them was a man not only of the highest military genius, but also of that energetic character which impresses its own type and ideas upon spirits feebler in conception. Miltiades was the head of one of the noblest houses at Athens. He ranked the Aeacidae among his ancestry, and the blood of Achilles flowed in the veins of the hero of Marathon. One of his immediate ancestors had acquired the dominion of the Thracian Chersonese, and thus the family became at the same time Athenian citizens and Thracian princes. This occurred at the time when Pisistratus was tyrant of Athens. 2 of the relatives of Miltiades, an uncle of the same name, and a brother named Stesagoras, had ruled the Chersonese before Miltiades became its prince. He had been brought up at Athens in the house of his father Cimon, who was renowned throughout Greece for his victories in the Olympic chariot races, and who must have been possessed of great wealth. The sons of Pisistratus, who succeeded their father in the tyranny at Athens, caused Cimon to be assassinated. But they treated the young Miltiades with favor and kindness, and when his brother Stesagoras died in the Chersonese, they sent him out there as lord of the principality. This was about 28 years before the Battle of Marathon, and it is with his arrival in the Chersonese that our first knowledge of the career and character of Miltiades commences. We find in the first act recorded of him the proof of the same resolute and unscrupulous spirit that marked his mature age. His brother's authority in the principality had been shaken by war and revolt. Miltiades determined to rule more securely. On his arrival, he kept close within his house, as if he was mourning for his brother. The principal men of the Chersonese, hearing of this, assembled from all the towns and districts, and went together to the house of Miltiades on a visit of condolence. As soon as he had thus got them in his power, he made them all prisoners. He then asserted and maintained his own absolute authority in the peninsula, taking into his pay a body of 500 regular troops, and strengthening his interest by marrying the daughter of the king of the neighboring Thracians. When the Persian power was extended to the Hellespont and its neighborhood, Miltiades, as prince of the Chersonese, submitted to King Darius, and he was one of the numerous tributary rulers who led their contingents of men to serve in the Persian army in the expedition against Scythia. Miltiades and the vassal Greeks of Asia Minor were left by the Persian king in charge of the bridge across the Danube when the invading army crossed that river and plunged into the wilds of the country that now is Russia, in vain pursuit of the ancestors of the modern Cossacks. On learning of the reverses that Darius met within the Scythian wilderness, Miltiades proposed to his companions that they should break the bridge down and leave the Persian king and his army to perish by famine and the Scythian arrows. The rulers of the Asiatic Greek cities whom Miltiades addressed shrank from this bold but ruthless stroke against the Persian power, and Darius returned in safety. But it was known what advice Miltiades had given, and the vengeance of Darius was thenceforth specially directed against the man who had counseled such a deadly blow against his empire and his person. The occupation of the Persian arms in other quarters left Miltiades for some years after this in possession of the Chersonese. but it was precarious and interrupted. He, however, availed himself of the opportunity which his position gave him of conciliating the goodwill of his fellow countrymen at Athens by conquering and placing under the Athenian authority the islands of Lemnos and Imbros, to which Athens had ancient claims, but which she had never previously been able to bring into complete subjection. At length, in B.C. 494, the complete suppression of the Ionian revolt by the Persians left their armies and fleets at liberty to act against the enemies of the great king to the west of the Hellespont. A strong squadron of Phoenician galleys was sent against the Chersonese. Miltiades knew that resistance was hopeless, and while the Phoenicians were at Tenedos, he loaded 5 galleys with all the treasure that he could collect and sailed away for Athens. The Phoenicians fell in with him and chased him hard along the north of the Aegean. One of his galleys, on board of which was his eldest son, Metiacus, was actually captured. But Miltiades, with the other 4, succeeded in reaching the friendly coast of Imbros in safety. Thence he afterward proceeded to Athens and resumed his station as a free citizen of the Athenian Commonwealth. The Athenians at this time had recently expelled Hippias, the son of Pisistratus, the last of their tyrants. They were in the full glow of their newly recovered liberty and equality, and the constitutional changes of Clisthenes had inflamed their republican zeal to the utmost. Miltiades had enemies in Athens, and these, availing themselves of the state of popular feeling, brought him to trial for his life for having been tyrant of the Chersonese. The charge did not necessarily import any acts of cruelty or wrong to individuals. It was founded on no specific law, but it was based on the horror with which the Greeks of that age regarded every man who made himself arbitrary master of his fellow men and exercised irresponsible dominion over them. The fact of Miltiades having so ruled in the Chersonese was undeniable. But the question which the Athenians assembled in judgment must have tried was whether Miltiades, although tyrant of the Chersonese, deserved punishment as an Athenian citizen. The eminent service that he had done the state in conquering Lemnos and Imbros for it pleaded strongly in his favor. The people refused to convict him. He stood high in public opinion, and when the coming invasion of the Persians was known, the people wisely elected him one of their generals for the year. 2 other men of high eminence in history, though their renown was achieved at a later period than that of Miltiades, were also among the 10 Athenian generals at Marathon. One was Themistocles, the future founder of the Athenian navy and the destined victor of Salamis. The other was Aristides, who afterward led the Athenian troops at Plataea, and whose integrity and just popularity acquired for his country, when the Persians had finally been repulsed, the advantageous preeminence of being acknowledged by half of the Greeks as their imperial leader and protector. It is not recorded what part either Themistocles or Aristides took in the debate of the council of war at Marathon. But from the character of Themistocles, his boldness, and his intuitive genius for extemporizing the best measures in every emergency, a quality which the greatest of historians ascribe to him beyond all his contemporaries, we may well believe that the vote of Themistocles was for prompt and decisive action. On the vote of Aristides, it may be more difficult to speculate. His predilection for the Spartans may have made him wish to wait till they came up. But though circumspect, he was neither timid as a soldier nor as a politician. And the bold advice of Miltiades may probably have found in Aristides a willing, most assuredly it found in him a candid hearer. Miltiades felt no hesitation as to the course which the Athenian army ought to pursue, and earnestly did he press his opinion on his brother generals. Practically acquainted with the organization of the Persian armies, Miltiades felt convinced of the superiority of the Greek troops, if properly handled. He saw with the military eye of a great general the advantage which the position of the forces gave him for a sudden attack, and as a profound politician, he felt the perils of remaining inactive and of giving treachery time to ruin the Athenian cause. One officer of the council of war had not yet voted. This was Callimachus, the war ruler. The votes of the general were 5 and 5, so that the voice of Callimachus would be decisive. On that vote, in all human probability, the destiny of all the nations of the world depended. Miltiades turned to him, and in simple soldierly eloquence, the substance of which we may read faithfully reported in Herodotus, who had conversed with the veterans of Marathon, the great Athenian thus adjured his countrymen to vote for giving battle. It now rests with you, Callimachus, either to enslave Athens, or by assuring her freedom, to win yourself an immortality of fame, such as not even Harmodius and Aristogiton have acquired. For never, since the Athenians were a people, were they in such danger as they are in this moment. If they bow the knee to these Medes, they are to be given up to Hippias, and you know what they will then have to suffer. But if Athens comes victorious out of this contest, she has it in her to become the first city of Greece. Your vote is to decide whether we are to join battle or not. If we do not bring on a battle presently, some factious intrigue will disunite the Athenians, and the city will be betrayed to the Medes. But if we fight before there is anything rotten in the state of Athens, I believe that, provided the gods will give fair play and no favor, we are able to get the best of it in an engagement. The vote of the brave war ruler was gained. The council determined to give battle. And such was the ascendancy and acknowledged military eminence of Miltiades that his brother generals, one and all, gave up their days of command to him, and cheerfully acted under his orders, fearful, however, of creating any jealousy, and of so failing to obtain the vigorous cooperation of all parts of his small army. Miltiades waited till the day when the chief command would have come round to him in regular rotation before he led the troops against the enemy. The inaction of the Asiatic commanders during this interval appears strange at first sight. But Hippias was with them, and they and he were aware of their chance of a bloodless conquest through the machinations of his partisans among the Athenians. The nature of the ground also explains in many points the tactics of the opposite generals before the battle, as well as the operations of the troops during the engagement. End of section 34. The Battle of Marathon, Part 1. Section 35 of The Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Battle of Marathon, B.C. 490, Part 2. The plain of Marathon, which is about 22 miles distant from Athens, lies along the bay of the same name on the northeastern coast of Attica. The plain is nearly in the form of a crescent and about 6 miles in length. It is about 2 miles broad in the center, where the space between the mountains and the sea is greatest, but it narrows toward either extremity, the mountains coming close down to the water at the horns of the bay. There is a valley trending inward from the middle of the plain, and a ravine comes down to it to the southward. Elsewhere, it is closely girt round on the land side by rugged limestone mountains, which are thickly studded with pines, olive trees, and cedars, and overgrown with the myrtle, arbutus, and the other low odoriferous shrubs that everywhere perfume the Attic air. The level of the ground is now varied by the mound raised over those who fell in the battle, but it was an unbroken plain when the Persians encamped on it. There are marshes at each end, which are dry in spring and summer, and then offer no obstruction to the horsemen, but are commonly flooded with rain, and so rendered impracticable for cavalry in the autumn, the time of year at which the action took place. The Greeks, lying encamped on the mountains, could watch every movement of the Persians on the plain below, while they were enabled completely to mask their own. Miltiades also had, from his position, the power of giving battle whenever he pleased, or of delaying it at his discretion, unless Datis were to attempt the perilous operation of storming the heights. If we turn to the map of the Old World to test the comparative territorial resources of the two states whose armies were now about to come into conflict, the immense preponderance of the material power of the Persian king over that of the Athenian Republic is more striking than any similar contrast which history can supply. It has been truly remarked that in estimating mere areas, Attica, containing on its whole surface only 700 square miles, shrinks into insignificance if compared with many a baronial fief of the Middle Ages, or many a colonial allotment of modern times. Its antagonist, the Persian Empire, comprised the whole of modern Asiatic and much of modern European Turkey, the modern kingdom of Persia, and the countries of modern Georgia, Armenia, Balkh, the Punjab, Afghanistan, Baluchistan, Egypt, and Tripoli. Nor could a European in the beginning of the 5th century before our era look upon this huge accumulation of power beneath the scepter of a single Asiatic ruler with the indifference with which we now observe on the map the extensive dominions of modern Oriental sovereigns. For, as has already been remarked, before Marathon was fought, the prestige of success and of supposed superiority of race was on the side of the Asiatic against the European. Asia was the original seat of human societies, and long before any trace can be found of the inhabitants of the rest of the world having emerged from the rudest barbarism, we can perceive that mighty and brilliant empires flourished in the Asiatic continent. They appear before us through the twilight of primeval history, dim and indistinct, but massive and majestic, like mountains in the early dawn. Instead, however, of the infinite variety and restless change which has characterized the institutions and fortunes of European states ever since the commencement of the civilization of our continent, a monotonous uniformity pervades the histories of nearly all Oriental empires, from the most ancient down to the most recent times. They are characterized by the rapidity of their early conquests, by the immense extent of the dominions comprised in them, by the establishment of a satrap or paschal system of governing the provinces, by an invariable and speedy degeneracy in the princes of the royal house, the effeminate nurslings of the seraglio succeeding to the warrior sovereigns reared in the camp, and by the internal anarchy and insurrections which indicate and accelerate the decline and fall of these unwieldy and ill-organized fabrics of power. It is also a striking fact that the governments of all the great Asiatic empires have in all ages been absolute despotisms, and herein is right in connecting this with another great fact, which is important from its influence both on the political and the social life of Asiatics. Among all the considerable nations of Inner Asia, the paternal government of every household was corrupted by polygamy. Where that custom exists, a good political constitution is impossible. Fathers being converted into domestic despots are ready to pay the same abject obedience to their sovereign which they exact from their family and dependents in their domestic economy. We should bear in mind also the inseparable connection between the state religion and all legislation which has always prevailed in the East, and the constant existence of a powerful sacerdotal body exercising some check, though precarious and irregular, over the throne itself, grasping at all civil administration, claiming the supreme control of education, stereotyping the lines in which literature and science must move, and limiting the extent to which it shall be lawful for the human mind to prosecute its inquiries. With these general characteristics rightly felt and understood, it becomes a comparatively easy task to investigate and appreciate the origin, progress, and principles of Oriental empires in general, as well as of the Persian monarchy in particular. And we are thus better enabled to appreciate the repulse which Greece gave to the arms of the East, and to judge of the probable consequences to human civilization if the Persians had succeeded in bringing Europe under their yoke, as they had already subjugated the fairest portions of the rest of the then known world. The Greeks, from their geographical position, formed the natural vanguard of European liberty against Persian ambition, and they preeminently displayed the salient points of distinctive national character which have rendered European civilization so far superior to Asiatic. The nations that dwelt in ancient times around and near the northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea were the first in our continent to receive from the East the rudiments of art and literature, and the germs of social and political organizations. Of these nations, the Greeks, through their vicinity to Asia Minor, Phoenicia, and Europe, were among the very foremost in acquiring the principles and habits of civilized life, and they also at once imparted a new and wholly original stamp on all which they received. Thus, in their religion, they received from foreign settlers the names of all their deities and many of their rites, but they discarded the loathsome monstrosities of the Nile, the Orontes, and the Ganges. They nationalized their creed, and their own poets created their beautiful mythology. No sacerdotal caste ever existed in Greece. So, in their governments, they lived long under hereditary kings, but never endured the permanent establishment of absolute monarchy. Their early kings were constitutional rulers, governing with defined prerogatives. And long before the Persian invasion, the kingly form of government had given way in almost all the Greek states to republican institutions, presenting infinite varieties of the blending or the alternate predominance of the oligarchical and democratical principles. In literature and science, the Greek intellect followed no beaten track and acknowledged no limitary rules. The Greeks thought their subjects boldly out, and the novelty of a speculation invested it in their minds with interest and not with criminality. Versatile, restless, enterprising, and self-confident, the Greeks presented the most striking contrast to the habitual quietude and submissiveness of the Orientals. And of all the Greeks, the Athenians exhibited these national characteristics in the strongest degree. This spirit of activity and daring, joined to a generous sympathy for the fate of their fellow Greeks in Asia, had led them to join in the last Ionian War, and now mingling with their abhorrence of the usurping family of their own citizens, which for a period had forcibly seized on and exercised despotic power at Athens, nerved them to defy the wrath of King Darius, and to refuse to receive back at his bidding the tyrant whom they had some years before driven out. The enterprise and genius of an Englishman have lately confirmed by fresh evidence, and invested with fresh interest, the might of the Persian monarch who sent his troops to combat at Marathon. Inscriptions in a character termed the arrow-headed or cuneiform had long since been known to exist on the marble monuments at Persepolis, near the site of ancient Susa, and on the faces of rocks in other places formerly ruled over by the early Persian kings. But for thousands of years they had been mere unintelligible enigmas to the curious but baffled beholder, and they were often referred to as instances of the folly of human pride, which could indeed write its own praises in the solid rock, but only for the rock to outlive the language, as well as the memory of the vainglorious inscribers. The elder Niebuhr, Grotefend, and Lassen had made some guesses at the meaning of the cuneiform letters, but Major Rawlinson of the East India Company's service, after years of labor, has at last accomplished the glorious achievement of fully revealing the alphabet and the grammar of this long unknown tongue. He has in particular fully deciphered and expounded the inscription on the sacred rock of Behistun on the western frontiers of Media. These records of the Achaemenidae have at length found their interpreter, and Darius himself speaks to us from the consecrated mountain, and tells us the names of the nations that obeyed him, the revolts that he suppressed, his victories, his piety, and his glory. Kings who thus seek the admiration of posterity are little likely to dim the record of their successes by the mention of their occasional defeats, and it throws no suspicion on the narrative of the Greek historians that we find these inscriptions silent respecting the overthrow of Datis and Artaphernes, as well as respecting the reverses which Darius sustained in person during his Scythian campaigns. But these indisputable monuments of Persian fame confirm and even increase the opinion with which Herodotus inspires us of the vast power which Cyrus founded and Cambyses increased, which Darius augmented by Indian and Arabian conquests, and seemed likely, when he directed his arms against Europe, to make the predominant monarchy of the world. With the exception of the Chinese Empire, in which throughout all ages down to the last few years, 1/3 of the human race has dwelt almost unconnected with the other portions, all of the great kingdoms which we know to have existed in ancient Asia were, in Darius' time, blended into the Persian. The northern Indians, the Assyrians, the Syrians, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Phoenicians, and the nations of Palestine, the Armenians, the Bactrians, the Lydians, the Phrygians, the Parthians, and the Medes, all obeyed the scepter of the great king. The Medes standing next to the native Persians in honor, and the empire being frequently spoken of as that of the Medes, or as that of the Medes and the Persians. Egypt and Cyrene were Persian provinces. The Greek colonists in Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean were Darius' subjects, and their gallant but unsuccessful attempts to throw off the Persian yoke had only served to rivet it more strongly and to increase the general belief that the Greeks could not stand before the Persians in a field of battle. Darius' Scythian war, though unsuccessful in its immediate object, had brought about the subjugation of Thrace and the submission of Macedonia. From the Indus to the Peneus, all was his. We may imagine the wrath with which the lord of so many nations must have heard 9 years before the Battle of Marathon that a strange nation toward the setting sun, called the Athenians, had dared to help his rebels in Ionia against him, and that they had plundered and burned the capital of one of his provinces. Before the burning of Sardis, Darius seems never to have heard of the existence of Athens, but his satraps in Asia Minor had for some time seen Athenian refugees at their provincial courts imploring assistance against their fellow countrymen. When Hippias was driven away from Athens, and the tyrannic dynasty of the Pisistratidae finally overthrown in BC 510, the banished tyrant and his adherents, after vainly seeking to be restored by Spartan intervention, had betaken themselves to Sardis, the capital city of the satrapy of Artaphernes. There Hippias, in the expressive words of Herodotus, began every kind of agitation, slandering the Athenians before Artaphernes, and doing all he could to induce the satrap to place Athens in subjection to him, as the tributary vassal of King Darius. When the Athenians heard of his practices, they sent envoys to Sardis to remonstrate with the Persians against taking up the quarrel of the Athenian refugees. But Artaphernes gave them in reply a menacing command to receive Hippias back again if they looked for safety. The Athenians were resolved not to purchase safety at such a price, and after rejecting the satrap's terms, they considered that they and the Persians were declared enemies. At this very crisis, the Ionian Greeks implored the assistance of their European brethren to enable them to recover their independence from Persia. Athens and the city of Eretria in Euboea alone consented. 20 Athenian galleys and 5 Eretrian crossed the Aegean Sea, and by a bold and sudden march upon Sardis, the Athenians and their allies succeeded in capturing the capital city of the haughty satrap, who had recently menaced them with servitude or destruction. They were pursued and defeated on their return to the coast, and Athens took no further part in the Ionian War, but the insult that she had put upon the Persian power was speedily made known throughout that empire, and was never to be forgiven or forgotten. In the emphatic simplicity of the narrative of Herodotus, the wrath of the great king is thus described. Now, when it was told to King Darius that Sardis had been taken and burned by the Athenians and Ionians, he took small heed of the Ionians, well knowing who they were, and that their revolt would soon be put down. But he asked who and what manner of men the Athenians were. And when he had been told, he called for his bow, and having taken it and placed an arrow on the string, he let the arrow fly toward heaven. And as he shot it into the air, he said, "O supreme God, grant me that I may avenge myself on the Athenians." And when he had said this, he appointed one of his servants to say to him every day as he sat at meat, "Sire, remember the Athenians." Some years were occupied in the complete reduction of Ionia, but when this was effected, Darius ordered his victorious forces to proceed to punish Athens and Eretria, and to conquer European Greece. The first armament sent for this purpose was shattered by shipwreck, and nearly destroyed off Mount Athos. But the purpose of King Darius was not easily shaken. A larger army was ordered to be collected in Cilicia, and requisitions were sent to all the maritime cities of the Persian Empire for ships of war and for transports of sufficient size for carrying cavalry as well as infantry across the Aegean. While these preparations were being made, Darius sent heralds round to the Grecian cities demanding their submission to Persia. It was proclaimed in the marketplace of each little Hellenic state, some with territories not larger than the Isle of Wight, that King Darius, the lord of all men, from the rising to the setting sun, required earth and water to be delivered to his heralds, as a symbolical acknowledgment that he was head and master of the country. Terror-stricken at the power of Persia, and at the severe punishment that had recently been inflicted on the refractory Ionians, many of the continental Greeks and nearly all the islanders submitted, and gave the required tokens of vassalage. At Sparta and Athens, an indignant refusal was returned, a refusal which was disgraced by outrage and violence against the persons of the Asiatic heralds. Fresh fuel was thus added to the anger of Darius against Athens, and the Persian preparations went on with renewed vigor. In the summer of B.C. 490, the army destined for the invasion was assembled in the Aleian plain of Cilicia near the sea. A fleet of 600 galleys and numerous transports was collected on the coast for the embarkation of troops, horse as well as foot. A Median general named Datis, and Artaphernes, the son of the satrap of Sardis, and who was also nephew of Darius, were placed in titular joint command of the expedition. The real supreme authority was probably given to Datis alone, from the way in which the Greek writers speak of him. We know no details of the previous career of this officer, but there is every reason to believe that his abilities and bravery had been proved by experience, or his Median birth would have prevented his being placed in high command by Darius. He appears to have been the first Mede who was thus trusted by the Persian kings after the overthrow of the conspiracy of the Median Magi against the Persians immediately before Darius obtained the throne. Datis received instructions to complete the subjugation of Greece, and especial orders were given him with regard to Eretria and Athens. He was to take these two cities, and he was to lead the inhabitants away captive and bring them as slaves into the presence of the great king. Datis embarked his forces in the fleet that awaited them, and coasting along the shores of Asia Minor till he was off Samos, he thence sailed due westward through the Aegean Sea for Greece, taking the islands in his way. The Naxians had 10 years before successfully stood a siege against the Persian armament, but they now were too terrified to offer any resistance, and fled to the mountain tops while the enemy burned their town and laid waste their lands. Thence Datis, compelling the Greek islanders to join him with their ships and men, sailed onward to the coast of Euboea. The little town of Carystus essayed resistance, but was quickly overpowered. He next attacked Eretria. The Athenians sent 4,000 men to its aid, but treachery was at work among the Eretrians, and the Athenian force received timely warning from one of the leading men of the city to retire to aid in saving their own country, instead of remaining to share in the inevitable destruction of Eretria. Left to themselves, the Eretrians repulsed the assaults of the Persians against their walls for 6 days. On the 7th, they were betrayed by 2 of their chiefs, and the Persians occupied the city. The temples were burned in revenge for the firing of Sardis, and the inhabitants were bound and placed as prisoners in the neighboring islet of Agilia, to wait there till Datis should bring the Athenians to join them in captivity, when both populations were to be led into Upper Asia, there to learn their doom from the lips of King Darius himself. Flushed with success and with half his mission thus accomplished, Datis re-embarked his troops, and crossing the little channel that separates Euboea from the mainland, he encamped his troops on the Attic coast at Marathon, drawing up his galleys on the shelving beach, as was the custom with the navies of antiquity. The conquered islands behind him served as places of deposit for his provisions and military stores. His position at Marathon seemed to him in every respect advantageous, and the level nature of the ground on which he camped was favorable for the employment of his cavalry, if the Athenians should venture to engage him. Hippias, who accompanied him and acted as the guide of the invaders, had pointed out Marathon as the best place for a landing, for this very reason. Probably Hippias was also influenced by the recollection that 47 years previously he, with his father Pisistratus, had crossed with an army from Eretria to Marathon, and had won an easy victory over their Athenian enemies on that very plain, which had restored them to tyrannic power. The omen seemed cheering. The place was the same, but Hippias soon learned to his cost how great a change had come over the spirit of the Athenians. But though the fierce democracy of Athens was zealous and true against foreign invader and domestic tyrant, a faction existed in Athens, as at Eretria, who were willing to purchase a party triumph over their fellow citizens at the price of their country's ruin. Communications were opened between these men and the Persian camp, which would have led to a catastrophe like that of Eretria, if Miltiades had not resolved and persuaded his colleagues to resolve on fighting at all hazards. When Miltiades arrayed his men for action, he staked on the arbitrament of one battle not only the fate of Athens, but that of all Greece. For if Athens had fallen, no other Greek state, except Lacedaemon, would have had the courage to resist, and the Lacedaemonians, though they would probably have died in their ranks to the last man, never could have successfully resisted the victorious Persians and the numerous Greek troops which would have soon marched under the Persian satraps had they prevailed over Athens. Nor was there any power to the westward of Greece that could have offered an effectual opposition to Persia had she once conquered Greece and made that country a basis for future military operations. Rome was at this time in her season of utmost weakness. Her dynasty of powerful Etruscan kings had been driven out, and her infant commonwealth was reeling under the attacks of the Etruscans and Volscians from without, and the fierce dissensions between the patricians and plebeians within. Etruria, with her Lucumos and serfs, Samnium had not grown into the might which she afterward put forth, nor could the Greek colonies in South Italy and Sicily hope to conquer when their parent states had perished. Carthage had escaped the Persian yoke in the time of Cambyses through the reluctance of the Phoenician mariners to serve against their kinsmen, but such forbearance could not long have been relied on, and the future rival of Rome would have become as submissive a minister of the Persian power as were the Phoenician cities themselves. If we turn to Spain, or if we pass the great mountain chain which, prolonged through the Pyrenees, the Cevennes, the Alps, and the Balkan, divides northern from southern Europe, we shall find nothing at that period but mere savage Finns, Celts, Slavs, and Teutons. Had Persia beaten Athens at Marathon, she could have found no obstacle to prevent Darius, the chosen servant of Ormuzd, from advancing his sway over all the known western races of mankind. The infant energies of Europe would have been trodden out beneath universal conquest, and the history of the world, like the history of Asia, have become a mere record of the rise and fall of despotic dynasties, of the incursions of barbarous hordes, and of the mental and political prostration of millions beneath the diadem, the tiara, and the sword. End of section 35. The Battle of Marathon, Part 2. Section 36 of The Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1, edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Battle of Marathon, B.C. 490, Part 3. Great as the preponderance of the Persian over the Athenian power at that crisis seems to have been, it would be unjust to impute wild rashness to the policy of Miltiades and those who voted with him in the Athenian Council of War, or to look on the after-currents of events as the mere fortunate result of successful folly. As before has been remarked, Miltiades, while prince of the Chersonese, had seen service in the Persian armies, and he knew by personal observation how many elements of weakness lurked beneath their imposing aspect of strength. He knew that the bulk of their troops no longer consisted of the hardy shepherds and mountaineers from Persia proper and Kurdistan who won Cyrus's battles, but that unwilling contingents from conquered nations now filled up the Persian muster rolls, fighting more from compulsion than from any zeal in the cause of their masters. He had also the sagacity and the spirit to appreciate the superiority of the Greek armor and organization over the Asiatic, notwithstanding former reverses. Above all, he felt and worthily trusted the enthusiasm of those whom he led. The Athenians whom he led had proved by their newborn valor in recent wars against the neighboring states that liberty and equality of civic rights are brave, spirit-stirring things, and they who, while under the yoke of a despot, had been no better men of war than any of their neighbors, as soon as they were free, became the foremost men of all. For each felt that in fighting for a free commonwealth, he fought for himself, and whatever he took in hand, he was zealous to do the work thoroughly. So the nearly contemporaneous historian describes the change of spirit that was seen in the Athenians after their tyrants were expelled. And Miltiades knew that in leading them against the invading army, where they had Hippias, the foe they most hated, before them, he was bringing into battle no ordinary men, and could calculate on no ordinary heroism. As for traitors, he was sure that whatever treachery might lurk among some of the higher-born and wealthier Athenians, the rank and file whom he commanded were ready to do their utmost in his and their own cause. With regard to future attacks from Asia, he might reasonably hope that one victory would inspirit all Greece to combine against a common foe, and that the latent seeds of revolt and disunion in the Persian Empire would soon burst forth and paralyze its energies so as to leave Greek independence secure. With these hopes and risks, Miltiades, on the afternoon of a September day, B.C. 490, gave the word for the Athenian army to prepare for battle. There were many local associations connected with those mountain heights, which were calculated powerfully to excite the spirits of the men, and of which the commanders well knew how to avail themselves in their exhortations to their troops before the encounter. Marathon itself was a region sacred to Hercules. Close to them was the fountain of Macaria, who had in days of yore devoted herself to death for the liberty of her people. The very plain on which they were to fight was the scene of the exploits of their national hero Theseus, and there, too, as old legends told, the Athenians and the Heraclidae had routed the invader Eurystheus. These traditions were not mere cloudy myths or idle fictions, but matters of implicit, earnest faith to the men of that day, and many a fervent prayer arose from the Athenian ranks to the heroic spirits who, while on earth, had striven and suffered on that very spot, and who were believed to be now heavenly powers, looking down with interest on their still beloved country, and capable of interposing with superhuman aid in its behalf. According to old national custom, the warriors of each tribe were arrayed together, neighbor thus fighting by the side of neighbor, friend by friend, and the spirit of emulation and the consciousness of responsibility excited to the very utmost. The war ruler, Callimachus, had the leading of the right wing. The Plataeans formed the extreme left, and Themistocles and Aristides commanded the center. The line consisted of the heavy-armed spearmen only, for the Greeks, until the time of Iphicrates, took little or no account of light-armed soldiers in a pitched battle, using them only in skirmishes or for the pursuit of a defeated enemy. The panoply of the regular infantry consisted of a long spear, of a shield, helmet, breastplate, greaves, and short sword. Thus equipped, they usually advanced slowly and steadily into action in a uniform phalanx of about 8 spears deep. But the military genius of Miltiades led him to deviate on this occasion from the commonplace tactics of his countrymen. It was essential for him to extend his line so as to cover all the practicable ground, and to secure himself from being outflanked and charged in the rear by the Persian horse. This extension involved the weakening of his line. Instead of a uniform reduction of its strength, he determined on detaching principally from his center, which, from the nature of the ground, would have the best opportunities for rallying if broken, and on strengthening his wings so as to ensure advantage at those points. And he trusted to his own skill and to his soldiers' discipline for the improvement of that advantage into decisive victory. In this order, and availing himself probably of the inequalities of the ground, so as to conceal his preparations from the enemy till the last possible moment, Miltiades drew up the 11,000 infantry whose spears were to decide this crisis in the struggle between the European and the Asiatic worlds. The sacrifices by which the favor of heaven was sought and its will consulted were announced to show propitious omens. The trumpet sounded for action, and, chanting the hymn of battle, the little army bore down upon the host of the foe. Then, too, along the mountain slopes of Marathon must have resounded the mutual exhortation which Aeschylus, who fought in both battles, tells us was afterward heard over the waves of Salamis. On, sons of the Greeks! Strike for the freedom of your country. Strike for the freedom of your children and your wives, for the shrines of your fathers' gold, and for the sepulchres of your sires. All are now staked upon the strife. Instead of advancing at the usual slow pace of the phalanx, Miltiades brought his men on at a run. They were all trained in the exercise of the palaestra, so that there was no fear of their ending the charge in breathless exhaustion. And it was of the deepest importance for him to traverse as rapidly as possible the mile or so of level ground that lay between the mountain foot and the Persian outposts, and so to get his troops into close action before the Asiatic cavalry could mount, form, and maneuver against him, or their archers keep him long under fire, and before the enemy's generals could fairly deploy their masses. When the Persians, says Herodotus, saw the Athenians running down on them without horse or bowmen and scanty in numbers, they thought them a set of madmen rushing upon certain destruction. They began, however, to prepare to receive them, and the eastern chiefs arrayed, as quickly as time and place allowed, the varied races who served in their motley ranks. Mountaineers from Hyrcania and Afghanistan, wild horsemen from the steppes of Khorasan, the black archers of Ethiopia, swordsmen from the banks of the Indus, the Oxus, the Euphrates, and the Nile, made ready against the enemies of the great king. But no national cause inspired them except the division of native Persians, and in the large host there was no uniformity of language, creed, race, or military system. Still, among them there were many gallant men under a veteran general. They were familiarized with victory, and in contemptuous confidence their infantry, which alone had time to form, awaited the Athenian charge. On came the Greeks with one unwavering line of leveled spears, against which the light targets, the short lances, and scimitars of the Orientals offered weak defense. The front rank of the Asiatics must have gone down to a man at the first shock. Still, they recoiled not, but strove by individual gallantry and by the weight of numbers to make up for the disadvantages of weapons and tactics, and to bear back the shallow line of the Europeans. In the center, where the native Persians and the Sacae fought, they succeeded in breaking through the weakened part of the Athenian phalanx, and the tribes led by Aristides and Themistocles were, after a brave resistance, driven back over the plain and chased by the Persians up the valley toward the inner country. There, the nature of the ground gave the opportunity of rallying and renewing the struggle. Meanwhile, the Greek wings, where Miltiades had concentrated his chief strength, had routed the Asiatics opposed to them, and the Athenian and Plataean officers, instead of pursuing the fugitives, kept their troops well in hand, and, wheeling round, they formed the two wings together. Miltiades instantly led them against the Persian center, which had hitherto been triumphant, but which now fell back and prepared to encounter these new and unexpected assailants. Aristides and Themistocles renewed the fight with their reorganized troops, and the full force of the Greeks was brought into close action with the Persian and Sacian divisions of the enemy. Datis's veterans strove hard to keep their ground, and evening was approaching before the stern encounter was decided. But the Persians, with their slight wicker shields, destitute of body armor, and never taught by training to keep the even front and act with the regular movement of the Greek infantry, fought at heavy disadvantage with their shorter and feebler weapons against the compact array of well-armed Athenian and Plataean spearsmen, all perfectly drilled to perform each necessary evolution in concert, and to preserve a uniform and unwavering line in battle. In personal courage and in bodily activity, the Persians were not inferior to their adversaries. Their spirits were not yet cowed by the recollection of former defeats, and they lavished their lives freely, rather than forfeit the fame which they had won by so many victories. While their rear ranks poured an incessant shower of arrows over the heads of their comrades, the foremost Persians kept rushing forward, sometimes singly, sometimes in desperate groups of 10 or 12, upon the projecting spears of the Greeks, striving to force a lane into the phalanx, and to bring their scimitars and daggers into play. But the Greeks felt their superiority, and though the fatigue of the long continued action told heavily on their inferior numbers, the sight of the carnage that they dealt upon their assailants nerved them to fight still more fiercely on. At last, the previously unvanquished lords of Asia turned their backs and fled, and the Greeks followed, striking them down to the water's edge, where the invaders were now hastily launching their galleys and seeking to embark and fly. Flushed with success, the Athenians attacked and strove to fire the fleet. But here the Asiatics resisted desperately, and the principal loss sustained by the Greeks was in the assaults on the ships. Here fell the brave war ruler Callimachus, and the general Sestilas, and the other Athenians of note. 7 galleys were fired, but the Persians succeeded in saving the rest. They pushed off from the fatal shore, but even here the skill of Datis did not desert him, and he sailed round to the western coast of Attica in hopes to find the city unprotected and to gain possession of it from some of the partisans of Hippias. Miltiades, however, saw and counteracted his maneuver. Leaving Aristides and the troops of his tribe to guard the spoil and the slain, the Athenian commander led his conquering army by a rapid night march back across the country to Athens. And when the Persian fleet had doubled the Cape of Sunium and sailed up to the Athenian harbor in the morning, Datis saw arrayed on the heights above the city the troops before whom his men had fled on the previous evening. All hope of further conquest in Europe for the time was abandoned, and the baffled armada returned to the Asiatic coasts. After the battle had been fought, but while the dead bodies were yet on the ground, the promised reinforcement from Sparta arrived. 2,000 Lacedaemonian spearmen, starting immediately after the full moon, had marched the 150 miles between Athens and Sparta in the wonderfully short time of 3 days. Though too late to share in the glory of the action, they requested to be allowed to march to the battlefield to behold the Medes. They proceeded thither, gazed on the dead bodies of the invaders, and then, praising the Athenians and what they had done, they returned to Lacedaemon. The number of the Persian dead was 6,400. Of the Athenians, 192. The number of the Plataeans who fell is not mentioned, but as they fought in the part of the army which was not broken, it cannot have been large. The apparent disproportion between the losses of the two armies is not surprising when we remember the armor of the Greek spearmen, and the impossibility of heavy slaughter being inflicted by sword or lance on troops so armed, as long as they kept firm in their ranks. The Athenian slain were buried on the field of battle. This was contrary to the usual custom, according to which the bones of all who fell fighting for their country in each year were deposited in a public sepulchre in the suburb of Athens called Ceramicus. But it was felt that a distinction ought to be made in the funeral honors paid to the men of Marathon, even as their merit had been distinguished over that of all other Athenians. A lofty mound was raised on the plain of Marathon, beneath which the remains of the men of Athens who fell in the battle were deposited. 10 columns were erected on the spot, one for each of the Athenian tribes, and on the monumental column of each tribe were graven the names of those of its members whose glory it was to have fallen in the great battle of liberation. The antiquarian Pausanias read those names there 600 years after the time when they were first graven. The columns have long perished, but the mound still marks the spot where the noblest heroes of antiquity repose. A separate tumulus was raised over the bodies of the slain Plataeans, and another over the light-armed slaves who had taken part and had fallen in the battle. There was also a separate funeral monument to the general to whose genius the victory was mainly due. Miltiades did not live long after his achievement at Marathon, but he lived long enough to experience a lamentable reverse of his popularity and success. As soon as the Persians had quitted the western coasts of the Aegean, he proposed to an assembly of the Athenian people that they should fit out 70 galleys with a proportionate force of soldiers and military stores, and place it at his disposal, not telling them whither he meant to lead it. but promising them that if they would equip the force he asked for and give him discretionary powers, he would lead it to a land where there was gold in abundance to be won with ease. The Greeks of that time believed in the existence of eastern realms teeming with gold, as firmly as the Europeans of the 16th century believed in El Dorado of the West. The Athenians probably thought that the recent victor of Marathon and former officer of Darius was about to lead them on a secret expedition against some wealthy and unprotected cities of treasure in the Persian dominions. The armament was voted and equipped and sailed eastward from Attica, no one but Miltiades knowing its destination until the Greek isle of Paros was reached, when his true object appeared. In former years, while connected with the Persians as prince of the Chersonese, Miltiades had been involved in a quarrel with one of the leading men among the Pereans, who had injured his credit and caused some slights to be put upon him at the court of the Persian satrap Hydarnes. The feud had ever since rankled in the heart of the Athenian chief, and he now attacked Paros for the sake of avenging himself on his ancient enemy. His pretext as general of the Athenians was that the Pereans had aided the armament of Datis with a war galley. The Pereans pretended to treat about terms of surrender, but used the time which they thus gained in repairing the defective parts of the fortifications of their city, and they then set the Athenians at defiance. So far, says Herodotus, the accounts of all the Greeks agree, but the Pereans in after years told also a wild legend, how a captive priestess of a Perean temple of the deities of earth promised Miltiades to give him the means of capturing Paros, how, at her bidding, the Athenian general went alone at night and forced his way into a holy shrine near the city gate, but with what purpose it was not known, how a supernatural awe came over him, and in his flight he fell and fractured his leg, how an oracle afterward forbade the Pereans to punish the sacrilegious and traitorous priestess, because it was fated that Miltiades should come to an ill end, and she was only the instrument to lead him to evil. Such was the tale that Herodotus heard at Paros. Certain it was that Miltiades either dislocated or broke his leg during an unsuccessful siege of the city, and returned home in evil plight with his baffled and defeated forces. The indignation of the Athenians was proportionate to the hope and excitement which his promises had raised. Xanthippus, the head of one of the first families in Athens, indicted him before the supreme popular tribunal for the capital offense of having deceived the people. His guilt was undeniable, and the Athenians passed their verdict accordingly. But the recollections of Lemnos and Marathon, and the sight of the fallen general who lay stretched on a couch before them, pleaded successfully in mitigation of punishment, and the sentence was commuted from death to a fine of 50 talents. This was paid by his son, the afterward illustrious Cimon, Miltiades dying, soon after the trial, of the injury which he had received at Paros. The melancholy end of Miltiades, after his elevation to such a height of power and glory, must often have been recalled to the minds of the ancient Greeks by the sight of one in particular of the memorials of the great battle which he won. This was the remarkable statue, minutely described by Pausanias, which the Athenians in the time of Pericles caused to be hewn out of a huge block of marble, which it was believed had been provided by Datis to form a trophy of the anticipated victory of the Persians. Phidias fashioned out of this a colossal image of the goddess Nemesis, the deity whose peculiar function was to visit the exuberant prosperity both of nations and individuals, with sudden and awful reverses. This statue was placed in a temple of the goddess at Rhamnus, about 8 miles from Marathon. Athens itself contained numerous memorials of her primary great victory. Panenus, the cousin of Phidias, represented it in fresco on the walls of the painted porch, and centuries afterward the figures of Miltiades and Callimachus at the head of the Athenians were conspicuous in the fresco. The tutelary deities were exhibited taking part in the fray. In the background were seen the Phoenician galleys, and nearer to the spectator, the Athenians and the Plataeans, distinguished by their leather helmets, were chasing routed Asiatics into the marshes and the sea. The battle was sculptured also on the Temple of Victory in the Acropolis, and even now there may be traced on the frieze of the figures of the Persian combatants with their lunar shields, their bows and quivers, their curved scimitars, their loose trousers, and Phrygian tiaras. These and other memorials of Marathon were the produce of the meridian age of Athenian intellectual splendor, of the age of Phidias and Pericles. For it was not merely by the generation whom the battle liberated from Epeius and the Medes that the transcendent importance of their victory was gratefully recognized. Through the whole epoch of her prosperity, through the long Olympiads of her decay, through centuries after her fall, Athens looked back on the day of Marathon as the brightest of her national existence. By a natural blending of patriotic pride with grateful piety, the very spirits of the Athenians who fell at Marathon were deified by their countrymen. The inhabitants of the district of Marathon paid religious rites to them, and orators solemnly invoked them in their most impassioned adjurations before the assembled men of Athens. Nothing was omitted that could keep alive the remembrance of a deed which had first taught the Athenian people to know its own strength by measuring it with the power which had subdued the greater part of the known world. The consciousness thus awakened fixed its character, its station, and its destiny. It was the spring of its later great actions and ambitious enterprises. It was not indeed by one defeat, however signal, that the pride of Persia could be broken, and her dreams of universal empire dispelled. 10 years afterward, she renewed her attempts upon Europe on a grander scale of enterprise, and was repulsed by Greece with greater and reiterated loss. Larger forces and heavier slaughter than had been seen at Marathon signalized the conflicts of Greeks and Persians at Artemisium, Salamis, Plataea, and the Eurymedon. But mighty and momentous as these battles were, they ranked not with Marathon in importance. They originated no new impulse. They turned back no current of fate. They were merely confirmatory of the already existing bias which Marathon had created. The day of Marathon is the critical epoch in the history of the two nations. It broke forever the spell of Persian invincibility, which had previously paralyzed men's minds. It generated among the Greeks the spirit which beat back Xerxes, and afterward led on Xenophon, Agesilaus, and Alexander in terrible retaliation through their Asiatic campaigns. It secured for mankind the intellectual treasures of Athens, the growth of free institutions, the liberal enlightenment of the Western world, and the gradual ascendancy for many ages of the great principles of European civilization. End of section 36. End of the Battle of Marathon.
Section 37 of the Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Invasion of Greece by Persians under Xerxes. Defense of Thermopylae. B.C. 480 by Herodotus. Part 1. The invasion of Greece by Xerxes is the subject of the great history written in 9 books by Herodotus. His object is to show the preeminence of Greece, whose fleets and armies defeated the forces of the Persians after these latter had triumphed over the most powerful nations of the earth. Xerxes collected a vast army from all parts of the empire. The Phoenicians furnished him with an enormous fleet, and he made a bridge of a double line of boats across the Hellespont and cut a canal through the peninsula of Mount Athos. He reached Sardis in the autumn of B.C. 481, and the next year his army crossed the bridge of boats, taking 7 days and 7 nights for the transit. The number of his fighting men was over 2.5 millions. His ships of war were 1,207 in number, and he had 3,000 smaller vessels for carrying his land forces and supplies. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, in the northeast of Greece, this immense army was checked for a while by the heroic Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, who, however, perished in their attempt to prevent the Persians' attack on Athens, which city was almost entirely destroyed by the invaders. The sea fight of Salamis was won by the Greeks against enormous odds, and in the Battle of Platea, B.C. 479, the defeat of the Persians by the Greek land forces was made more complete by the death of Mardonius, the most renowned general of Xerxes. The Greeks, when they arrived at the isthmus, consulted on the message they had received from Alexander, in what way and in what places they should prosecute the war. The opinion which prevailed was that they should defend the pass at Thermopylae, for it appeared to be narrower than that into Thessaly, and at the same time nearer to their own territories. For the path by which the Greeks who were taken at Thermopylae were afterwards surprised, they knew nothing of till, on their arrival at Thermopylae, they were informed of it by the Trachinians. They accordingly resolved to guard this pass, and not suffer the barbarian to enter Greece, and that the naval force should sail to Artemisium, in the territory of Histiaeotis, for these places are near one another, so that they could hear what happened to each other. These spots are thus situated. In the first place, Artemisium is contracted from a wide space of the Thracian Sea into a narrow frith, which lies between the island of Sciathus and the continent of Magnesia. From the narrow frith begins the coast of Euboea, called Artemisium, and in it is a temple of Diana. But the entrance into Greece through Trachis, in the narrowest part, is no more than half a plethrum in width. However, the narrowest part of the country is not in this spot, but before and behind Thermopylae. For near Alpeni, which is behind, there is only a single carriage road, and before, by the river Phoenix, near the city of Anthela, is another single carriage road. On the western side of Thermopylae is an inaccessible and precipitous mountain, stretching to Mount Oeta, and on the eastern side of the way is the sea and a morass. In this passage there are hot baths, which the inhabitants call Chytri, and above these is an altar to Hercules. A wall had been built in this pass, and formerly there were gates in it. The Phocians built it through fear, when the Thessalians came from Thesprotia to settle in the Aeolian territory which they now possess. Apprehending that the Thessalians would attempt to subdue them, the Phocians took this precaution. At the same time, they diverted the hot water into the entrance, that the place might be broken into clefts. having recourse to every contrivance to prevent the Thessalians from making inroads into their country. Now this old wall had been built a long time, and the greater part of it had already fallen through age, but they determined to rebuild it, and in that place to repel the barbarian from Greece. Very near this road there was a village called Alpini. From this the Greeks expected to obtain provisions. Accordingly, these situations appeared suitable for the Greeks, for they, having weighed everything beforehand, and considered that the barbarians would neither be able to use their numbers nor their cavalry, there resolved to await the invader of Greece. As soon as they were informed that the Persians were in Pieria, breaking up from the isthmus, some of them proceeded by land to Thermopylae, and others by sea to Artemisium. The Greeks, therefore, being appointed in 2 divisions, hastened to meet the enemy. But at the same time the Delphians, alarmed for themselves and for Greece, consulted the oracle, and the answer given them was that they should pray to the winds, for that they would be powerful allies to Greece. The Delphians, having received the oracle, first of all communicated the answer to those Greeks who were zealous to be free, and as they very much dreaded the barbarians, by giving that message they acquired a claim to everlasting gratitude. After that, the Delphians erected an altar to the winds at Thea, where there is an enclosure consecrated to Thea, daughter of Cephisus, from whom this district derives its name, and conciliated them with sacrifices. And the Delphians, in obedience to that oracle, to this day propitiate the winds. The naval force of Xerxes, setting out from the city of Therma, advanced with 10 of the fastest sailing ships straight to Sciathus, where there were 3 Grecian ships keeping a lookout, a Troezenian, an Aeginetan, and an Athenian. These, seeing the ships of the barbarians at a distance, betook themselves to flight. The Troezenian ship, which Praxinus commanded, the barbarians pursued and soon captured, and then, having led the handsomest of the marines to the prow of the ship, they slew him, deeming it a good omen that the first Greek they had taken was also very handsome. The name of the man that was slain was Leon, and perhaps he, in some measure, reaped the fruits of his name. The Aeginetan ship, which Isonides commanded, gave them some trouble. Pythias, son of Aeschines, being a marine on board, a man who on this day displayed the most consummate valor, who, when the ship was taken, continued fighting until he was entirely cut to pieces. But when, having fallen, he was not dead, but still breathed, the Persians who served on board the ships were very anxious to save him alive on account of his valor, healing his wounds with myrrh, and binding them with bandages of flaxen cloth. And when they returned to their own camp, they showed him with admiration to the whole army, and treated him well. But the others whom they took in this ship they treated as slaves. Thus then 2 of the ships were taken, but the other, which Phormus, an Athenian, commanded, in its flight ran ashore at the mouth of the Peneus, and the barbarians got possession of the ship, but not of the men. For as soon as the Athenians had run the ship aground, they leaped out, and proceeded through Thessaly, reached Athens. The Greeks who were stationed at Artemisium were informed of this event by signal-flares from Sciathus, and being informed of it, and very much alarmed, they retired from Artemisium to Chalcis, intending to defend the Euripus, and leaving scouts on the heights of Euboea. Of the 10 barbarian ships, 3 approached the sunken rock called Myrmex, between Sciathus and Magnesia. Then the barbarians, when they had erected on the rock a stone column which they had brought with them, set out from Therma, now that every obstacle had been removed, and sailed forward with all their ships, having waited 11 days after the king's departure from Therma. Pammon, a Scyrian, pointed out to them this hidden rock, which was almost directly in their course. The barbarians, sailing all day, reached Sepias in Magnesia and the shore that lies between the city of Casthanea and the coast of Sepias. As far as this place and Thermopylae, the army had suffered no loss, and the numbers were at that time, as I find by calculations, of the following amount: of those in ships from Asia, amounting to 1,207. Originally, the whole number of the several nations was 241,400 men, allowing 200 to each ship. And on these ships 30 Persians, Medes, and Sacae served as marines, in addition to the native crews of each. This farther number amounts to 36,210. To this and the former number I add those that were on the Pentaconters, supposing 80 men on the average to be on board of each. 3,000 of these vessels were assembled, therefore the men on board them must have been 240,000. This then was the naval force from Asia, the total being 517,610. Of infantry there were 1,700,000, and of cavalry 80,000. To these I add the Arabians, who drove camels, and the Libyans, who drove chariots, reckoning the number at 20,000 men. Accordingly, the numbers on board the ships and on the land added together make up 2,317,610. This then is the force which has been mentioned was assembled from Asia itself, exclusive of the servants that followed, and the provision ships, and the men that were on board them. But the force brought from Europe must still be added to this whole number that has been summed up, but it is necessary to speak by guess. Now the Grecians from Thrace and the islands contiguous to Thrace furnished 120 ships. These ships give an amount of 24,000 men. Of land forces which were furnished by Thracians, Paeonians, and the Eordi, the Boeotians, the Chalcidian race, Brygi, Pyrians, Macedonians, Perrhaebi, Aenianes, Dolopians, Magnesians, and Achaeans, together with those who inhabit the maritime parts of Thrace, of these nations I suppose that there were 300,000 men, so that these myriads, added to those from Asia, make a total of 2,641,610 fighting men. I think that the servants who followed them, and with those on board the provision ships, and other vessels that sailed with the fleet, were not fewer than the fighting men, but more numerous. But supposing them to be equal in number to the fighting men, they make up the former number of myriads. Thus, Xerxes, son of Darius, led 5,283,220 men to Sepias and Thermopylae. This then was the number of the whole force of Xerxes. But of women who made bread, and concubines, and eunuchs, no one could mention the number with accuracy, nor of draft cattle and other beasts of burden, nor of Indian dogs that followed could anyone mention the number. They were so many. Therefore I am not astonished that the streams of some rivers failed, but rather it is a wonder to me how provisions held out for so many myriads. For I find by calculation, if each man had a chenix of wheat daily, and no more, 110,340 medimni must have been consumed every day. And I have not reckoned the food for the women, eunuchs, beasts of burden, and dogs, but of these myriads of men not one of them, for beauty and stature, was more entitled than Xerxes himself to possess the supreme command. When the fleet, having set out, sailed and reached the shore of Magnesia, that lies between the city of Casthanea and the coast of Sepias, the foremost of the ships took up their station close to land. Others behind rode at anchor, the beach not being extensive enough, with their prows toward the sea, and 8 deep. Thus they passed the night. But at daybreak, after serene and tranquil weather, the sea began to swell, and a heavy storm with a violent gale from the east, which those who inhabit these parts call a Hellenspontane, burst upon them. As many of them then as perceived the gale increasing, and who were able to do so from their position, anticipated the storm by hauling their ships on shore, and both they and their ships escaped. But such of the ships as the storm caught at sea, it carried away, some to the parts called Ipni near Pelion, others to the beach. Some were dashed on Cape Sepias itself, some were wrecked at Melibue, and others at Casthanea. The storm was indeed irresistible. The barbarians, when the wind had lulled and the waves had subsided, having hauled down their ships, sailed along the continent, and having doubled the promontory of Magnesia, stood directly into the bay leading to Bagasse. There is a spot in this bay of Magnesia where it is said Hercules was abandoned by Jason and his companions when he had been sent from the Argo for water, as they were sailing to Colchis in Asia for the Golden Fleece, and from there they purposed to put out to sea after they had taken in water. From this circumstance the name of Aphete was given to the place. In this place, then, the fleet of Xerxes was moored. 15 of these ships happened to be driven out to sea some time after the rest, and somehow saw the ships of the Greeks at Artemisium. The barbarians thought that they were their own, and sailing on fell among their enemies. They were commanded by Sandoces, son of Thaumaceus, governor of Cyme, of Aeolia. He, being one of the royal judges, had been formerly condemned by King Darius, who had detected him in the following offense, to be crucified. Sandoces gave an unjust sentence for a bribe, but while he was actually hanging on the cross, Darius, considering within himself, found that the services he had rendered to the royal family were greater than his faults. Darius, therefore, having discovered this, and perceiving that he himself had acted with more expedition than wisdom, released him. Having thus escaped being put to death by Darius, he survived. But now, sailing down among the Grecians, he was not to escape a second time, for when the Greeks saw them sailing toward them, perceiving the mistake that they had committed, they bore down upon them and took them. King Xerxes encamped in the Tritinian territory of Malis, and the Greeks in the pass. This spot is called by most of the Greeks Thermopylae, but by the inhabitants and neighbors Hyla. Both parties were encamped in these places. The one was in possession of all the parts toward the north as far as Trachis, and the others of the parts which stretched toward the south and meridian of this continent. The following were the Greeks who awaited the Persians in this position. Of Spartans, 300 heavy armed men. Of Tegeans and Martinians, 1,000, half of each. From Orchomenus in Arcadia, 120. And from the rest of Arcadia, 1,000. There were so many Arcadians. From Corinth, 400. From Phlius, 200 men, and from Mycenae, 80. These came from Peloponnesus. From Boeotia, of Thespians, 700, and of Thebans, 400. In addition to these, the Opuntian Locrians, being invited, came with all their forces, and 1,000 Phocians, for the Greeks themselves had invited them, representing by their ambassadors that they had arrived as forerunners of the others, and that the rest of the allies might be daily expected, that the sea was protected by them, being guarded by the Athenians, the Aeginetia, and others, who were appointed to the naval service, and that they had nothing to fear, for that it was not a god who invaded Greece, but a man, and that there never was, and never would be, any mortal who had not evil mixed with his prosperity from his very birth, and to the greatest of them the greatest reverses happen, that it must therefore needs be that he who is marching against us, being a mortal, will be disappointed in his expectation. They, having heard this, marched with assistance to Trachis. These nations had separated generals for their several cities, but the one most admired, and who commanded the whole army, was a Lacedaemonian, Leonidas, son of Anaxandrides, son of Leon, son of Eucratides, son of Anaxander, son of Eurycates, son of Polydorus, son of Alcamenes, son of Teleclus, son of Archelaus, son of Agesilaus, son of Dorissus, son of Leobotes, son of Echestratus, son of Agis, son of Eurysthenes, son of Aristodemus, son of Aristomachus, son of Cleodaeus, son of Hylas, son of Hercules, who had unexpectedly succeeded to the throne of Sparta. For as he had two elder brothers, Cleomenes and Dorius, he was far from any thought of the kingdom. However, Cleomenes having died without male issue, and Dorius being no longer alive, having ended his days in Sicily, the kingdom thus devolved upon Leonidas, both because he was older than Cleombrotus, for he was the youngest son of Anaxandrides, and also because he had married the daughter of Cleomenes. He then marched to Thermopylae, having chosen the 300 men allowed by law, and such as had children. On his march he took with him the Thebans, whose numbers I have already reckoned, and whom Leontiades, son of Eurymachus, commanded. For this reason Leonidas was anxious to take with him the Thebans alone of all the Greeks, because they were strongly accused of favoring the Medes. He therefore summoned them to the war, wishing to know whether they would send their forces with him, or would openly renounce the alliance of the Grecians. But they, though otherwise minded, sent assistance. The Spartans sent these troops first with Leonidas, in order that the rest of the allies, seeing them, might take the field, and might not go over to the Medes if they had heard that they were delaying. But afterward, for the Carnian festival was then an obstacle to them, they purposed, when they had kept the feast, to leave a garrison in Sparta, and to march immediately with their whole strength. The rest of the confederates likewise intended to act in the same manner, for the Olympic games occurred at the same period as these events. As they did not, therefore, suppose that the engagement at Thermopylae would soon be decided, they dispatched an advance guard. The Greeks at Thermopylae, when the Persians came near the pass, being alarmed, consulted about a retreat. Accordingly, it seemed best to the other Peloponnesians to retire to Peloponnesus, and guard the isthmus. But Leonidas, perceiving the Phocians and Locrians were very indignant at this proposition, determined to stay there, and to dispatch messengers to the cities, desiring them to come to their assistance, they being too few to repel the army of the Medes. While they were deliberating on these matters, Xerxes sent a scout on horseback, to see how many they were and what they were doing. For while he was still in Thessaly, he had heard that a small army had been assembled at that spot, and as to their leaders, that they were Lacedaemonians, and Leonidas, who was of the race of Hercules. When the horseman rode up to the camp, he reconnoitred, and saw not indeed the whole camp, for it was not possible that they should be seen, who were posted within the wall, which having rebuilt they were now guarding, but he had a clear view of those on the outside, whose arms were piled in front of the wall. At this time the Lacedaemonians happened to be posted outside, and some of the men he saw performing gymnastic exercises, and others combing their hair. On beholding this he was astonished, and ascertained their number, and having informed himself of everything accurately, he rode back at his leisure, for no one pursued him, and he met with general contempt. On his return he gave an account to Xerxes of all that he had seen. When Xerxes heard this, he could not comprehend the truth, that the Grecians were preparing to be slain and to slay to the utmost of their power, but as they appeared to behave in a ridiculous manner, he sent for Demaratus, son of Ariston, who was then in the camp, and when he was to come into his presence, Xerxes questioned him as to each particular, wishing to understand what the Lacedaemonians were doing. Demaratus said, "You before heard me, when we were setting out against Greece, speak of these men, and when you heard, you treated me with ridicule, though I told you in what way I foresaw these matters would issue. For it is my chief aim, O king, to adhere to the truth in your presence. Hear it therefore once more. These men have to fight with us for the pass, and are now preparing themselves to do so. For such is their custom, when they are going to hazard their lives, then they dress their heads. But be assured, if you conquer these men, and those that remain in Sparta, there is no other nation in the world that will dare to raise its hand against you, O king, for you are now to engage with the noblest kingdom and city of all among the Greeks, and with the most valiant men." What was said seemed incredible to Xerxes, and he asked again, how being so few in number they could contend with his army. He answered, "O king, deal with me as with a liar, if these things do not turn out as I say." But saying this, he did not convince Xerxes. He therefore let 4 days pass, constantly expecting that they would be taking themselves to flight. But on the 5th day, as they had not retreated, but appeared to him to stay through arrogance and rashness, he, being enraged, sent them Medes and Cesians against them, with orders to take them alive, and bring them into his presence. When the Medes bore down impetuously upon the Greeks, many of them fell. Others followed to the charge, and were not repulsed, though they suffered greatly. But they made it evident to every one, and not least of all to the king himself, that they were indeed many men but few soldiers. The engagement lasted through the day. End of Part 1. End of Section 37. Section 38 of The Great Events, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Invasion of Greece by Persians under Xerxes. Defense of Thermopylae. B.C. 480 by Herodotus. Part 2. When the Medes were roughly handled, they thereupon retired, and the Persians, whom the king called Immortal, and whom Hydarnes commanded, taking their place, advanced to the attack, thinking that they indeed would easily settle the business. But when they engaged with the Grecians, they succeeded no better than the Medic troops, but just the same. As they fought in a narrow space and used shorter spears than the Greeks, they were unable to avail themselves of their numbers. The Lacedaemonians fought memorably in other respects, showing that they knew how to fight with the men who knew not, and whenever they turned their backs they retreated in close order. But the barbarians, seeing them retreat, followed with a shout and a clamor. Then they, being overtaken, wheeled round so as to front the barbarians, and having faced about, overthrew an inconceivable number of the Persians, and then some few of the Spartans themselves fell. so that when the Persians were unable to gain anything in their attempt on the pass by attacking in troops and in every possible manner, they retired. It is said that during these onsets of the battle, the king who witnessed them thrice sprang from his throne, being alarmed for his army. Thus they strove at that time. On the following day the barbarians fought with no better success, for considering that the Greeks were few in number, and expecting that they were covered with wounds, and would not be able to raise their heads against them any more, they renewed the contest. But the Greeks were marshaled in companies, and according to their several nations, and each fought in turn, except only the Phocians. They were stationed at the mountain to guard the pathway. When, therefore, the Persians found nothing different from what they had seen on the preceding day, they retired. While the king was in doubt what course to take in the present state of affairs, Ephialtes, son of Eurydemus, a Malian, obtained an audience of him, expecting that he should receive a great reward from the king, and informed him of the path which leads over the mountain to Thermopylae, and by that means caused the destruction of those Greeks who were stationed there. But afterwards, fearing the Lacedaemonians, he fled to Thessaly, and when he fled, a price was set on his head by the Pylagori when the Amphictyons were assembled at Pylae. But some time after, he went down to Anticyra, and was killed by Athenides, the Trachinian. Another account is given that Onites, son of Phanagoras, a Carystian, and Cordalis of Anticyra, were the persons who gave this information to the king and conducted the Persians round the mountains. But to me this is by no means credible. For in the first place, we may draw the inference from this circumstance that the Pylagori of the Grecians set a price on his head, not of Onites and Corydalus, but of Ephialtes, the Trachinian, having surely ascertained the exact truth. And in the next place, we know that Ephialtes fled on that account. Onites, indeed, though he was not a Malian, might be acquainted with this path, if he had been conversant with the country. But it was Ephialtes who conducted them round the mountain by the path, and I charge him as the guilty person. Xerxes, since he was pleased with what the Ephialtes promised to perform, being exceedingly delighted, immediately dispatched Hydarnes and the troops that Hydarnes commanded, and he started from the camp about the hour of lamplighting. The native Malians discovered this pathway, and, having discovered it, conducted the Thessalians by it, against the Phocians at the time when the Phocians, having fortified the pass by a wall, were under shelter from attack. From that time it appeared to have been of no service to the Malians. This path is situated as follows. It begins from the river Aesopus, which flows through the cleft. The same name is given both to the mountain and to the path, Anopiae. And this Anopiae extends along the ridge of the mountain and ends near Alpinus, which is the first city of the Locrians toward the Malians, and by the rock called Melumpegus, and by the seats of the Cercopes, and there the path is the narrowest. Along this path, thus situate, the Persians, having crossed the Aesopus, marched all night, having on their right the mountains of the Oeacians, and on their left those of the Trachinians. Morning appeared, and they were on the summit of the mountain. At this part of the mountain, as I have already mentioned, 1,000 heavy-armed Phocians kept guard, to defend their own country and to secure the pathway. For the lower pass was guarded by those before mentioned, and the Phocians had voluntarily promised Leonidas to guard the path across the mountain. The Phocians discovered them after they had ascended, in the following manner. For the Persian ascended without being observed, as the whole mountain was covered with oaks. There was a perfect calm, and, as was likely, a considerable rustling taking place from the leaves strewn underfoot. The Phocians sprang up, and put on their arms, and immediately the barbarians made their appearance. But when they saw men clad in armor, they were astonished, for expecting to find nothing to oppose them, they fell in with an army. Thereupon Hydarnes, fearing lest the Phocians might be Lacedaemonians, asked Ephialtes of what nation the troops were, and being accurately informed, he drew up the Persians for battle. The Phocians, when they were hit by many and thick falling arrows, fled to the summit of the mountain, supposing that they had come expressly to attack them, and prepared to perish. Such was their determination. But the Persians, with Ephialtes and Hydarnes, took no notice of the Phocians, but marched down the mountain with all speed. To those of the Greeks who were at Thermopylae, the augur Megistias, having inspected the sacrifices, first made known the death that would befall them in the morning. Certain deserters afterward came and brought intelligence of the circuit the Persians were taking. These brought the news while it was yet night. And thirdly, the scouts running down from the heights as soon as day dawned brought the same intelligence. Upon this the Greeks held a consultation, and their opinions were divided. Some would not hear of abandoning their post, and others opposed that view. After this, when the assembly broke up, some of them departed, and being dispersed, betook themselves to their several cities, but others of them prepared to remain there with Leonidas. It is said that Leonidas himself sent them away, being anxious that they should not perish, but that he and the Spartans who were there could not honorably desert the post which they originally came to defend. For my own part, I am rather inclined to think that Leonidas, when he perceived that the allies were averse and unwilling to share the danger with him, bade them withdraw, but that he considered it dishonorable for himself to depart. On the other hand, by remaining there, great renown would be left for him, and the prosperity of Sparta would not be obliterated. For it had been announced to the Spartans by the Pythian, when they consulted the oracle concerning this war as soon as it commenced, that either Lacedaemon must be overthrown by the barbarians or their king perish. The answer she gave, in hexameter verses, to this effect: To you, O inhabitants of spacious Lacedaemon, either your vast glorious city shall be destroyed by men, sprung from Perseus, or, if not so, the confines of Lacedaemon shall mourn a king deceased of the race of Hercules, for neither shall the strength of bulls nor of lions withstand him, with force opposed to force, for he has the strength of Jove, and I say he shall not be restrained before he has certainly obtained one of these for his share. I think, therefore, that Leonidas, considering these things, and being desirous to acquire glory for the Spartans alone, sent away the allies, rather than that those who went away differed in opinion, and went away in such an unbecoming manner. The following, in no small degree, strengthens my conviction on this point. For not only did he send away the others, but it is certain that Leonidas also sent away the augur, who followed the army, Megistias the Acarnanian, who was said to have been originally descended from Melampus, the same who announced, from an inspection of the victims, what was about to befall them, in order that he might not perish with them. He, however, though dismissed, did not himself depart, but sent away his son, who served with him in the expedition, being his only child. The allies that were dismissed accordingly departed, and obeyed Leonidas, but only the Thespians and the Thebans remained with the Lacedaemonians. The Thebans, indeed, remained unwillingly and against their inclination, for Leonidas detained them, treating them as hostages. But the Thespians willingly, for they refused to go away and abandon Leonidas and those with him, but remained and died with them. Demophilus, son of Diodromus, commanded them. Xerxes, after he had poured out libations at sunrise, having waited a short time, began his attack about the time of full market, for he had been so instructed by Ephialtes. For the descent from the mountain is more direct, and the distance much shorter than the circuit and descent. The barbarians, therefore, with Xerxes, advanced, and the Greeks with Leonidas, marching out as if for certain death, now advanced much farther than before into the wide part of the defile, for the fortification of the wall had protected them, and they on the preceding days, having taken up their position in the narrow part, fought there. But now engaging outside the narrows, great numbers of the barbarians fell, for the officers of the companies from behind, having scourges, flogged every man, constantly urging them forward. In consequence, many of them, falling into the sea, perished, and many more were trampled alive under foot by one another, and no regard was paid to any that perished. For the Greeks, knowing that death awaited them at the hands of those who were going round the mountain, being desperate and regardless of their own lives, displayed the utmost possible valor against the barbarians. Already were most of their javelins broken, and they had begun to dispatch the Persians with their swords. In this part of the struggle fell Leonidas, fighting valiantly, and with him other eminent Spartans, whose names, seeing they were deserving men, I have ascertained. Indeed, I have ascertained the names of the whole 300. On the side of the Persians also, many other eminent men fell on this occasion, and among them 2 sons of Darius, Abracomes and Hyperanthes, born to Darius of Phrataguna, daughter of Artanes, but Artanes was brother to King Darius, and son of Hystaspes, son of Arsames. He, when he gave his daughter to Darius, gave him also his property, and she was his only child. Accordingly, 2 brothers of Xerxes fell at this spot, fighting for the body of Leonidas, and there was a violent struggle between the Persians and Lacedaemonians, until at last the Greeks rescued it by their valor and 4 times repulsed the enemy. Thus the contest continued until those with Ephialtes came up. When the Greeks heard that they were approaching, from this time the battle was altered, for they retreated to the narrow part of the way, and passing beyond the wall, came and took up their position on the rising ground, all in a compact body, with the exception of the Thebans. The rising ground is at the entrance where the stone lion now stands, to the memory of Leonidas. On this spot, while they defended themselves with swords, such as had them still remaining, and with hands and teeth, the barbarians overwhelmed them with missiles, some of them attacking them in front, having thrown down the wall, and others surrounding and attacking them on every side. Though the Lacedaemonians and Thespians behaved in this manner, yet Dieneces, a Spartan, is said to have been the bravest man. They relate that he made the following remark before they engaged with the Medes, having heard a Trachinian say that when the barbarians let fly their arrows, they would obscure the sun by the multitude of their shafts, so great was their number. But he, not at all alarmed at this, said, holding in contempt the number of the Medes, that their Trachinian friend told them everything to their advantage, since if the Medes obscure the sun, they would then have to fight in the shade and not in the sun. This and other sayings of the same kind they relate that Dieneces, the Lacedaemonian, left as memorials. Next to him, 2 Lacedaemonian brothers, Alpheus and Maron, sons of Oresiphantus, are said to have distinguished themselves most. And of the Thespians he obtained the greatest glory, whose name was Dithyrambus, son of Harmatides. In honor of the slain, who were buried on the spot where they fell, and of those who died before they who were dismissed by Leonidas went away, the following inscription has been engraved over them, 4,000 from Peloponnesus once fought on this spot, with 300 myriads. This inscription was made for all, and for the Spartans in particular. Stranger, go tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here obedient to their commands. This was for the Lacedaemonians, and for the prophet the following. This is the monument of the illustrious Megistias, whom once the Medes, having passed the river Spercheius, slew, a prophet who, at the time well knowing the impending fate, would not abandon the leaders of Sparta. The Amphictyons are the persons who honored them with these inscriptions and columns, with the exception of the inscription to the prophet, that of the prophet Megistias, Simonides, son of Leoprepes, caused to be engraved from personal friendship. End of section 38. End of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 1. Edited by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.